go ahead and call the meeting to order. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Basine?
Here.
Campson?
Here.
Gabriel?
Here.
Jordan?
Here.
Martin?
Here.
Rousen?
Here.
Clanton?
Present. Do I hear a motion to enter executive closed session?
I move we enter closed session.
All right, thank you, Ms. Campson. Do I hear a second?
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Dr. Martin. Madam Clerk, will you please read the resolution?
Yes. Move that the members of the school board go into a closed session for the purposes which are set under subsection A of section 2.2-3711 of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act as amended for discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific public officers, appointees, or employees of the school board of the City of Norfolk, pursuant to subsection 2.2-3711A1 of the Act. The subjects of this portion of the session are the personnel on today's regular personnel agenda, a complaint from a former employee, the annual evaluation of the division superintendent required by Virginia Code sections 22.1-60.1 and 22.1-253.13:5, and the renegotiation of the superintendent's contract pursuant to Virginia Code section 22.1-60. Also B, discussion of the terms of scope of a public contract pursuant to subsection 2.2-3711A2-29 of the Act. The subject of this portion of the session concerns billing pursuant to various provisions of the contract for governance training between the school board and the Valbrun Group. And C, consultation with legal counsel and briefing by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual or probable litigation where discussion in open session would adversely affect the school board's negotiating or litigating posture, and consultation with legal counsel regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by counsel pursuant to subsections 2.2-3711A7 and 8 of the Act. The subjects of this portion of the session are those set out above in subsections A and B of this motion to the extent consultation with legal counsel is needed. Basine?
No. Is there any discussion related to the motion? All right, hearing none, Madam Clerk, call the roll.
Okay. Basine?
Aye.
Campson?
Aye.
Gabriel?
Aye.
Jordan?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Rousen?
Aye.
Clanton?
Aye. All right, we're going to executive closed session. Do I hear a motion to certify the executive closed session?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we certify the executive closed session.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gabriel. Do I hear a second?
I second.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rousen. It's been moved and properly seconded that we certify the executive closed session. Madam Clerk, will you please read the resolution?
Yes. A resolution certifying an executive meeting of the School Board of the City of Norfolk in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, whereas the School Board of the City of Norfolk has convened a closed meeting on this date pursuant to an affirmative recorded vote and in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and whereas Section 2.2-3712 of the Code of Virginia requires the certification by the School Board of the City of Norfolk that such closed meeting was conducted in conformity with Virginia law. Now therefore it be resolved that the School Board of the City of Norfolk hereby certifies that, to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements by Virginia law were discussed in the executive meeting to which this certification resolution applies, and only such public business matters were identified in the motion convening in the executive meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by the School Board of the City of Norfolk. Basine?
Aye.
Campson?
Aye.
Gabriel?
Aye.
Jordan?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Rousen?
Aye.
Clanton?
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Aye.
It was on the backside of my
Motion carries,
page.
like,
Hard to remember the guy's name, that's what it is.
all right.
You were on side too.
Yeah, definitely. It's
so
all
funny,
right.
they go in.
Thank you, everyone. We have our governance trainers that are here. Before that, I would like to take a motion, a point of personal privilege, to just address one item here and to make a statement. First, I regret that there's been some confusion regarding my upcoming parent and guardian forum at Richard Bowling Elementary School. Let me take this opportunity to clarify. I'm hosting this forum in my official capacity as the school board's Ward 3 representative. As you recall, in our governance training, we are all encouraged to be listening post for our community. This is an effort to do just that. Thus, it is an effort to outreach, part of my outreach strategy, and I encourage other board members who are welcome to employ and do so. I asked the board clerk to post the notice to board docs so that we could follow board members, that my fellow board members could be aware of the event. And also, I do not want to discount that other board members might want to attend and make sure that you're aware. But, you know, if we have more than 3 or more board members who gather an event, it could potentially constitute a public meeting. And therefore, mindful of open meeting requirements, I felt that it'd be wise that the board clerk post this on the actual board docs. The board clerk's protocol is to post meetings on board docs and social media. So she followed that protocol in that particular case. And the question that some board members have raised is that since it's not a social division-sponsored event, should it have been posted on division resources? And again, I am hosting this event as my official capacity as a Ward 3 representative, and therefore, and also now being the board chair, I wanted to open up. I've continuously always had public meetings and forums, both virtually, for parents. Therefore, it's appropriate to advise the community accordingly through the school division's resources. However, there are questions. There are questions that we don't necessarily have protocol in place. And so I know after conferring with our attorneys, I've made the decision to postpone until there's been some additional clarity around that. And hopefully, I think that even when we go through governance training here today, we can even talk about what some of the potential norms and protocols could be for the board. So with that, I just wanted to bring some clarity around that one, that this is not anything campaign related. Matter of fact, I haven't made anything public about me running for re-election, but this is in the thing that I do every year. I'm engaging our parents and engaging community members. So with that, I hope that answers that one. I believe that raising it to the level of public and making it transparent, that's one of the things I've held myself being accountable on, is transparent and accountable. That's why I'm bringing it at this particular point and not through an email. With that, Ms. Valda, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Could I ask just one question
I think there
first?
should be discussion here about that. I mean,
Could I
we
just
should
ask-
be able to respond.
Should do what?
We should be able to respond to your statement.
There's nothing to respond at this point. It's in the attorney's office for them to bring clarity and to bring it back.
Could I just
Yes,
ask a
Ms.
sideline
Sampson.
question?
Yes.
Not just, I am already getting my letters ready to send out to my civic leagues, because I always do that every year, and I then go into every single civic league. I try and do, well, kind of got thrown up with the pandemic, but my goal always is to see all of my civic leagues the first semester and all of them the second semester. And you have to start early because those days
Yeah.
block up and they have the same dates to have it on. And is that now in trouble to be able to meet with your civic leagues?
So essentially what we're doing.
Sounds the same.
Yeah, essentially what we're doing is it's been assigned to the city attorney's office so that they can come back and bring clarity on this. And as we go through the process of governance and we start, I believe we're going to talk about norms and protocol, if we raise that this is, I believe, one of the things that we want to do, to talk about that, because we talked about community engagement, that's something that we will have an opportunity to discuss through your governance training. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ms.
Mr. Chair, I would like to speak to it, if I may.
So at this particular point, because we are under contractually agreed, we've got to move with that one.
Yeah,
I think
like
that
to-
it will be addressed during
I'd
our
like to
governance training.
tie it to the agenda and just say that.
You're not recognized. I just said that we're moving to governance training at
So
this
you took
particular
a
point,
point
and that
of
we will.
personal privilege, but you won't allow
Yes, as the
others?
chair, I did. I
Hmm?
did.
Not
I-
bringing
And
our
we
board
will have an
together.
opportunity, I think, through our governance training to talk about this. We are taking away the time that we said that we need to do at this point. It will be addressed.
I apologize.
It's okay.
I object to that.
I
think that
object as well.
part of our goal, part of our challenge is having an understanding of our roles and responsibilities. The norms around community engagement aren't new. And I think the issue that the attorney's office is looking at is dealing with something separate from what do we do in our roles and how do we make sure, per our oath and per our policies, that we don't unintentionally cause conflict where it seems like what we do as individuals represents or could misrepresent the board's position or the divisions. But we can talk about that throughout the day.
We can definitely talk about that. And we'll also talk about hopefully misinformation that's placed out there and disinformation around actions of board members as well. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ms. Fowler.
Yeah, we are going to speak to developing some norms around communication. I think that's probably an appropriate place to think about some of the behaviors that you want to see that match that. What does that look like in terms of putting some processes in place? So, thank you for having us back.
Welcome.
Before we move on, do we need to adopt the personnel?
We do.
docket?
Oh, thank
Okay,
you.
Sorry.
Throwing me off.
Sorry.
So if there any objection to the personal docket being adopted?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we adopt the personnel docket.
I was just going to do it by general consent. Is there any objection? All right, hearing none, the personal docket stands approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So, welcome. Well, I guess I'm going to get myself back.
Welcome back.
Thank you. So here's our objectives for today. We want to continue to move this board forward. So we want to continue to build this collaborative, centered, trusting relationship for unifying this board and the superintendent in the service of Norfolk Public School students. So I'm going to always continue to ground us in this work and its purpose, which is to really be able to move this work forward in the service of students. We're going to clarify and define roles and responsibilities and have some discussion around that. We're going to talk about the norms and protocols for working together. And in our time together, I want us to memorialize, right, these shared beliefs, the values, the attitudes, the behaviors that govern this board and the superintendent's work moving forward. And then we want to talk about putting in place strategies to create coherence and begin to set some strategic direction that's in alignment to the strategic plan. Now, we won't specifically speak to the strategic plan today. I know there's some discussion around it, and it's being revised and all those good things, but I do want us to still be grounded in the strategic plan being what we use to drive the work forward. And so when I reference strategic plan, while we won't speak to it specifically today, we're going to make sure that you're always focused on the goals and objectives and the key performance measures that are in the strategic plan, because that's the work of the board, is to ensure that those things occur. So I'm going to always ground us in reminding us that we are a community of practice. You as members of this board, you have this shared concern, this common concern, right? You're going to solve problems together. You're coming together for the good of the students in this district. Communities of practice focus on sharing best practice, creating new knowledge, and advancing professional practice. And so, again, I'm going to always remind us that we are a community of practice. When we're together and we're doing this work and we're learning together, it's because we have this shared endeavor. And you see in the graphic there, right, the things that define us: common purpose, success for students. I'm going to always bring us back to that. Support and encouragement, willingness to learn from one another, and I would also say with one another, wanting the best for and from our students, right? Flexibility, willingness to ask and tackle those tough questions, and most importantly, being patient with each other, being supportive, and really thinking about how can we have interdependence among this group of folks. And so I don't take lightly this definition of community of practice, because I think that that's what makes groups of people work together, right? And so I'm going to always start our meetings with reminding us of this definition, that you guys are a community of practice. While we might operate as, you say, our title is that we're board members, as board members, you are still a community of practice. And so just continue to keep this definition front of mind.
And if I could just add something
Absolutely.
real quick. We do, at Valbrun Consulting, we are a community of practice. And I'm Inger Swims. This was my way of introducing myself.
I was going to do that at some point.
It's my segue. But one of the things that, again, I really do appreciate is that we are a community of practice, and so we do a lot of those things that are defining us. I'm Inger Swimson. I am one of the senior consultants with the Valbrun Consulting Group. I am a retired administrator and educator, always going to be an educator and teacher. I retired from Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, and after almost 30 years, pretty much 30 years in the school system, I still enjoy the work of education, and I still enjoy and believe in making sure that our students are not only getting their best academically, because that's just a part of who they are, but really helping them to be their best socially, to be their best emotionally, mentally, physically. All of those things that we think about as adults when we define what excellence looks like, or what greatness looks like, or what, being a good human looks like. So that community of practice is certainly important.
And all the things that you just described, right, like how we plan for the whole child, I think school boards fail to realize that sometimes it starts with you, right? You create the conditions for that. You create the conditions and the policies and the practices and set governance around the behaviors that will allow for that to occur and to create the conditions for students to show up as their full selves and be successful. And so, I think you guys are the ultimate community of practice in a school district. I know we often like to say that, research says that the teacher is the most important person in a schoolhouse, and they are. And then it's like they say the second most important is the principal. But who gives guidance to the teacher and the principal, right? The district policy is set in this room. And so I think that when you think about these communities of practice, you guys are the most important community of practice in driving forward the work of the district. And so I hope that it just reminds you all of how important your role and responsibility is in this work. So the overarching essential questions that we want to focus on, how will you as board members live and advance the mission statement? I know we're going to talk about the mission statement at some point, so I'll get to that. But even still, right, the one that does exist, how do you live it? How do you advance it? How do you enact upon it, right? Because all this work should be vision and mission driven and should be aligned to the core values that have been set forth. The other question that I want you to keep in front of mind is what is your responsibility, both personally and professionally, to dismantle, to reimagine, and to rebuild policies and practices that meet the needs of each Norfolk Public Schools student. I will always bring this question forward for us, right? And you'll see that there's very intentional language in the way that it's phrased, because we speak to each Norfolk Public School student versus every and all. Remember last time I talked about we don't want to use the language of every and all, because then we end up planning for the majority, right? And so we want to be thinking about what does each student need in order to be successful here? And even the language of dismantling and reimagining, right? Dismantling is different than disrupting systems, right? Dismantling, I always use the example of Legos. You take something apart, you can dismantle, but you put it together in a new and a better way. And so as a board, you have the responsibility for creating those systems, for dismantling the systems we know are not serving kids, and then coming together as a community of practice to reassemble, to reimagine, and put them back together in ways that do benefit students. So that's the essential question we always want to keep working on. So you'll see these essential questions each time I come to you, because we want to make sure that this is our work, that we're living and advancing the mission, but that we're also making sure that we're doing what needs to be done to create the systems for each student to thrive, right? So our norms for our time together, we're going to build norms for you all as a board, but I always like to start with the norms for us in our working space, right? And so you've seen it before, right? We want to keep our eyes on the prize. It can get really easy to be derailed, and so by what I call keeping our eye on the prize is knowing that we all care deeply about students, right? I always say that the one job of a school system is to educate all the children that are part of it, right? And so everything needs to be centered in what is best for students. So we will always, and I will always remind us and make connections back to students, right? So we want to keep our eyes on the prize. The prize is our students, and care deeply about them in all of the work that we do. Speak your truth, but create space for multiple truths. And what that one means is really that while something may not be your experience, right, that doesn't mean that it's not true for someone, right? And so we always want to make sure that we're recognizing that there are different perspectives, different ways of looking at things, and people approach them differently based on their lived experience. And so just keeping in mind that, yes, we should all speak our truths, but we should recognize that one person's truth is not any truer than another's, right? Step up, step back, and monitor your privilege. I love that last time I was here and I shared this norm, we actually referenced it later on, and folks said we were really good about monitoring our privilege, right? So we adopted that language already. So stepping up and stepping back and monitoring your privilege is recognizing, where you're taking up some, verbal space or emotional space, right, that may be impeding or impacting the others in the room, right? And so just some self-regulating, right, as it relates to being able to kind of bring forth opinions. And then again, staying engaged, because in this space we are all equal. I think that's really important for us to always keep front of mind as well. We also want to just make sure that we're following this way of thinking, right? We want to get proximate to the problem or problems, right? And stay focused, right? In this case, the problem that we're trying to address, among the problems we're trying to address, is that of thinking about how do you all govern in a way that is cohesive and collaborative and that serves the students well. we also want to focus on changing the narrative, because the narrative that's out there now, even the narrative in the room, right? The narrative when we had our one-on-ones, the narrative is a negative narrative. And that doesn't serve you well, and it certainly doesn't serve the community well. And so a lot of this work is about how do we change that narrative for the better, right? In doing so, you're going to have to expect inconvenience and discomfort, right? You have to, and it was uncomfortable when I was here last time. I get that, and I promise you, probably will continue to be in that way. There was already discomfort in the room when we started this meeting, right? And I think that's okay. We just have to be able to recognize that we have to do the work to be able to move past that, right?
And yeah, one thing if I could add, especially with the discomfort, is really thinking about and pausing and reflecting on, well, what is it that's causing the discomfort? You know, kind of asking myself at this minute, why do I feel uncomfortable, and what's bringing that on? Because oftentimes when we think about it, it gives us a different perspective, and then that helps us to kind of recenter sometimes and go back to that first norm, getting proximate to the problem. What is it that is causing that discomfort? And really exploring that internally and reflecting on, how do I change that? Or how do I kind of sit with that discomfort? Because that's a natural part of growth, is discomfort.
And when we say to, stay committed and engage, because you can easily, disconnect and unplug, right? From this, I'm using exchange a moment ago, right? What we don't want to do is, because that exchange may have been uncomfortable for some, that those individuals check out and say, okay, I'm done here within the first 5 minutes of us coming together, right? And so we just want you to resist the urge, to allow yourself to be in that kind of a vein where if because of the way you're showing up, the work can't get done because you shut down, right? And so staying committed and engaged. And then respecting the process, right? I know that, many of you last time were like, well, what are we going to be doing? Like even when we had our planning call, well, folks want to see the scope of work from now to June, right? That's not trusting the process. That's not respecting the process, right? Yes, I will always foreshadow where we're going next, but I do need you to trust the process, because this is collaborative work. It's co-design. It's not prepackaged, right? And so let's respect the process of us going through this in a way that's we can build upon each time. We also want to be able to listen respectfully and respect confidentiality. So that goes back to the relationship building that needs to happen in this room among you all, so we can do this work with fidelity. I keep wanting to click here. Okay. And then I think the last one is the one I always like to leave people with, is that maintaining hope, even in the face of brutal facts, right? I think that you have to have a certain level of optimism to do this work, right? To keep showing up, right? Because if we all just kind of threw our hands up and was like, this is just never going to get better, or this is just who we are, right? Then if you lose that sense of hope, then you lose the incentive, right, to show up and to continue to do the work. And so I think it's really, really important that we maintain hope, even in the face of some brutal facts that we've kind of adopted as this is just how it is. I want us to maintain a sense of hope that we can make the changes that need to happen. As we do this work, let's hold space for all of our experiences and all the perspectives, but we also want to center on the experiences of those most impacted. Those most impacted by the work of this board are students and families, right? And so that should always be at the center of decisions, at the center of discussions, at the center of policy making, at the center of the incentive to do this work well. Recognize the limitations of your own lens, because we all have blind spots. I will always remind you of this when I come here. You will always see these. You're going to know these by heart by the time, a couple months from now, right? Recognizing the limitations of our own lenses. We all have blind spots. We all have biases. We all have preconceived notions that we show up with in the room, right? And it goes back to that self-regulating. Where might I have a limitation to my lens if this is landing on me in this way? If my response is this, right? Before articulating your concern, I think part of it is, like I always say, this whole mirror window thing, right? I'm going to look in the mirror and say, why am I feeling this way right now? Before I look out the window and say, you're making me feel this way, right? And so that recognizing the limitations of your own lens, because we all have blind spots, right? And again, embodying a posture of curiosity over judgment. As things are said and articulated, if you have questions about it, if you're curious about it, that's the vein you want to stay in, versus being judgmental or coming at it from an approach of that's wrong, or that person has their own agenda and all these different things. Essentially what I want us to do is I want us to let go of a lot of those first impulses that I think impact the behaviors, the attitudes, the emotions that come into a room, and they prevent us from being able to tackle the actual work because of feelings, right? And so I just, and we're all human beings, obviously. So of course you're going to bring your emotional self in, but I think it's important for us to maintain this sense of curiosity over judgment and recognizing our own limitations, because just that alone will help us to show up in a different way. Make sense?
And sometimes to kind of help as a reminder, it's really thinking, even when you're posing a question, I wonder, or a wondering that I have, because that positions the language around, I'm not judging, I'm just trying to deepen my understanding around something or deepen my learning around something. So using those terms, because language matters, we know that, language matters, so positioning ourselves in a place where we can begin to think, I wonder. And even if you don't have a chance to say it, just write it down. Write that wondering down and then come back to it. And even if it means talking with the person, pulling them aside and saying, here's one of the things that I was wondering about. Help me unpack that. It's a great way to begin a conversation or to go back to continue a conversation. And again, those are the ways that build relationships too.
Because, it's funny because I was sharing with Dr. Swimpson that, I can say to her, here's what happened at the last time, and she saw the notes. But I said, at the end of the day, what's really happening here is relationships that have been fractured, that have been damaged, right? And what that does is it impacts your ability to do the work that needs to happen for kids. And so we could spend all this time, we could do the woo-woo-woos, right, and go on retreats and go bowling and blah, 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 right? Which is what a lot of people, a lot of organizations do that. They say, oh, we're going to go build team, right? And they don't do this kind of work. They might do team building activities. So we're not doing team building activities. We're doing actual building of a team, building of a community of practice with a common goal, which is to govern this school system. Does that make sense? So it's different than like team building, right? Because team building is like when it's just activities and people go bowling and that kind of thing. Yeah, they might have a little fun and okay, we can go out and drink together, but if we still can't do the work together, right, then that's not true team building. So there's a toolkit for y'all. So you can, if you have your devices, you can actually use your phone. And you can scan the QR code, or if you have your device, you want to type in the bit.ly. A couple of resources in there, some of which I'll reference today. And there's a couple of, you'll have some homework that we'll refer back to towards the end. But there's a toolkit that has some articles and just some things that are aligned to what we'll be talking about today that you can have access to whenever. And I will add to the toolkit over the course of our time together, so I will always use the same QR code. And so each time that we're talking about topics and there's articles or current research that I would like to share with you, I will drop it in there. By no means am I saying you must read everything in the toolkit. I'm not giving you that kind of homework. But there is one piece that I am gonna ask you to read for our next time together. So was everybody able to access it? Did it open for everybody?
Could we get like hard copy of the presentation?
Yes, so I will, whenever.
All that would be on it?
Yes, after each session, like last time, I will PDF the slides and drop them in, so you'll have them.
It's not possible to get them as we walk in the door now? I mean, I understand you don't want us previewing them, duh. But
you make some copies.
But I'm so visual and, I'm so old.
Ms. Campbell's going to make some copies for you.
Yeah, that would be helpful, because I would be making notes.
Sure, you guys have, so you have, it's on the thumb drive, so I guess you can do PowerPoint notes and everybody will have lines next to it if that works. I'm fine with that. Okay, so everybody's able to access the toolkit, yes?
Yeah, if we can see it or not, that's a different story on your phone.
On your phone, it's tiny, yeah. And we'll reference, just as long as you can pull it up, and I'll show this. You'll have the QR code again on the slide that I'm going to need you to see it on, but I just want you to make sure you have it and you can save it and it'll be in your Google Drive. And as I drop things in there, even between our time together, you'll always have access to it. So that's going to be our toolkit folder. And even if I find an article or whatever that just might be of interest, I will drop it in there and maybe I'll shoot the chair and co-chair a note and say, hey, I dropped an article in there that's relevant, or here's what another district is doing or something like that. Just things that come across my desk, I'll drop them in. All right, let's do a quick recap of the things that we talked about last time, because we were together, was it, 4 weeks? Has it been that long?
Yeah,
July something? Wow. Yeah, July 6th, you're right.
6th.
Okay, so even more than that, 4 weeks. So quick recap. So we talked last time, and we're going to build on that learning. We talked last time about moral imperative. And remember one of the quotes that we pulled from our reading is that to be effective, school boards and superintendents must develop a governance mindset, a shared moral imperative, and unity of purpose using sound principles and practices, the keys to effective governance. And so you read chapters 1 and 2, so we're going to dig deeper into this idea of moral imperative, but mostly we're going to talk a lot about what governance mindset looks like and feels like with this board. So I'm going to continue to, we're going to dig into the text a little bit, so I'm going to refer you to a couple of pages, and you're going to do a couple of little activities where I'm going to have you go back to certain pages. So hopefully everybody did their homework and they read their 2 chapters, yes?
Yes.
Okay,
Of course,
see?
Of course, of course.
Really,
It's a good book, right?
It is a good book.
I whined when I had to start reading. I made myself get out my yellow marker.
Get your little highlighter out. Excellent.
Oh, you better believe, I don't read without highlighting.
Excellent. Excellent. So on page 18, you also saw that it said a shared moral imperative is a relentless commitment to the learning of all students, no exceptions. I love this quote, right? The no exceptions, I should have put that in red, must drive the work of the board and its individual and collective action, right? And so, you know, the reason why this struck me, why I said this has to be a slide, is because when we talked last time about each of you having what your own moral imperative was, and we talked about what does that mean for who we are as a board, it doesn't eliminate who you are as individuals, right? Because everybody has that thing that lights the fire in their belly. But we want you to be thinking about, like, if we all say that we're committed to what's best for kids, what's our collective moral imperative, right? And I think this will help drive, too, when we do the revision of the mission and vision statement. I want you to continue to reflect as you read, like, what is our moral imperative? What is the moral imperative we want the community to know? And that language should be reflected in the mission statement when we do the revision, which is not going to happen in today's session, by the way, so I'll tell you more about that later. But continue to think about this, like, what's the moral imperative? When we say that our work is grounded in what's best for all children, what does that look like? I believe that, you know, of course, all schools' moral imperative should be to do what is always best for kids. What is the filter? The filter should always be what's best for kids. When I was a principal, teachers would come to me and say, we want to do this, that, and the third. And they got to the point where they knew I was going to say, tell me what's in it for kids. Like, so then they started getting prepared. What's in it for kids is, right? Because I would always express to them our moral imperative as Walkersville Middle School is that every student who leaves here, right, leaves here with a good story. They leave here with a good experience. They leave here with a narrative around their middle school experience, but they can remember the names of their teachers, right? Like we always share stories about how I have a negative story tied to a teacher's name. My 35th high school reunion is in October, and they just put out, yours too? They just put out on Facebook this week our senior year video yearbook, which I'm not in, because I was like, well, where was I? And I said, oh, I was doing homework, I was studying, because I'm not in any of it, right? Which is funny to me. But I thought back, as I was watching it, I couldn't name some of the people, like some of the adults that were in the video, right? And there was a video, the principal had said something, and this is like 87, right? Principal said something, and I was like, oh, Mr. Shapiro. Now, I'm 53, so it's not a memory thing. It was just like he must not have had an impact on me, that it wasn't like when I immediately saw him, I thought, oh my God, look at Mrs. Shapiro. I was like, what was his name again? Shapiro. But then they got to Miss Burns, who was the reason why I became a teacher. And I was like, oh my God, look at Ellen Burns. And I was like, man, she was 40 then, how old is she now? Started doing the math, right? Immediately I made connections to who had an impact. And I would tell the teachers that I want, when our kids think back to their middle school experience, that they remember who you were, right, like quickly, and they have a story, and they have an immediate association. And I think that should be the same with you all, right? That you want when students go through, I'm not saying they got to know your names, right? Because your students are not going to remember who board members' names were. But you do want them to have a story that's attached to their experience when they were here in Norfolk Public Schools, right? And you all drive that. You create that narrative. That goes back to that norm about how do we change the narrative. So you drive that narrative around what the experience was like when they were here. So I think that's a big part of this moral imperative. And we should always be thinking about what's my individual role in that, and then what's our collective role as a community of practice in moving that forward. And so that's why this quote stands out for me.
Yeah. And even if you aren't, even if students don't remember who board members are, you all remember who your teachers were that you grew up with that made a difference for you. And you know the ones who if you saw them today, you would still be like, ugh. So we want you to conjure up that memory of, oh yeah, that was a great teacher. that's the experience through policy and through governance that you all have the opportunity to create for students. So think about that as well as you're moving through the day.
Yeah. And then the other quote that I pulled that hopefully you know these are my highlights. You probably highlighted some of these similar passages as you were reading, right? It says the moral imperative is about all children learning. It consists of strategies to ensure that the learning occurs. It involves rapport between the board and the superintendent, which is what we're working towards, right? It consists of strong, focused relationships between the board and staff, right? It sorts out what is working and not in specific terms. It zeroes in on indicators of progress. It combines excellence and equity, right? How many of you had that same passage highlighted? Love it, see, right? And because that's our work, that's the work. And you see some of the terms that I highlighted there, right? Rapport between board and superintendent, strong focused relationships, indicators of progress. You all are the ultimate progress monitors of the work of the district. And that progress monitoring comes from monitoring the impact of the the strategic plan implementation. That's the board's work. So you all are the ones that zero in on indicators of progress that get us to the excellence and equity that we espouse, that we want for students. So when we were together last as well, we talked about the 8 characteristics of effective school boards, and we tallied up your self-assessment. And I want to share with you the results again, and you got them in the notes, but you'll see strongly disagree column is the first column, then disagree, not applicable, and agree, and then strongly agree. And you see the place that had the majority of you feeling like you strongly disagree was that this school board is a united team with the superintendent, each from their respective roles with strong collaboration and mutual trust. And so that tells me that that's where our primary work needs to be, our priority work needs to be. If we know that an effective school board is one where you are a unified team and where you have collaboration and trust, and that doesn't exist, how does anything else happen?
Question. Can you just remind me what the numbers are again? That's how each of us rated. Just remind me the numbers in the column.
Oh, so the first one, so it goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree.
For one person.
And those are the numbers.
Yeah,
of people.
the number of
person did
people.
four.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All
right.
thanks.
So there should be 8 because Dr. Birdsong was in there as well, right? So each column should equal 8 all across. Make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And I'll leave it up for a second just to take a look. And I highlighted the one where we had the majority of folks strongly disagree, but you see there are other areas where there was strong disagreement and disagreement, right? And very little agreement and strong agreement. And so either way, of all the characteristics of all 8, right? Yeah. The feeling among you is that we're not there. We're not there. But the one that struck me was with the majority of folks saying we're not a united team. We're not united with the superintendent, right? So that tells me that's where we've got to be thinking about grounding that, and everything else we do is this unifying and not unifying for each other, unifying for who?
The kids.
Children.
Yes.
The children, absolutely. And then this is a reminder slide too. They said that, in addition to the research on those 8 characteristics, it was also that this commitment to kids and conviction around the importance of public education and, the ability to accept the will of the majority, right? I think that's a big part of it too. Being prepared for meetings, right? Those logistical things that we're going to talk about. Are you okay? The logistical things we talked about, that we're going to build some norms around, right? Resist springing surprises at meetings, abiding by policies and rules, holding off on making personal decisions until all the evidence is there. These are all behaviors that we want to see that are going to drive this work, right? Striving to foster unity and harmony among the board, differentiating between a problem that requires board action and those that should be solved by school level administration. We're going to talk about roles and responsibilities in a little bit. Supporting the superintendent's authority, sharing responsibility for decisions, accepting and evaluating criticism objectively, avoiding personality conflicts. That's something we have to talk about in this room, right? Listening to constituents, right, which goes back to providing opportunities for constituents to share feedback, right? That's all part of what your work should be. And then respecting the corporate authority and responsibility of the board, which we're going to talk about as well today. So again, this is the research. This is not like what Valda thinks a high-performing board looks like. This is what we know a high-performing board looks like, and we got to get us there. It's our charge. So you all said last time we were together that if we would be a high-performing board if we, I know the type is small, but you said if you focus on priorities of student performance. So students come up several times here, right? It's on the second column as well, focus on the children. It's in the third column, stay student-focused, stay student-centered. You use that language quite a bit, right? Like we want to be student-centered, dedicate ourselves to better understanding the role of the superintendent to get to student achievement, right? Take time to breathe and better understand and appreciate each person's talents, what you bring, right? You know, I think we got to create conditions where you can bring those talents into the room. We're going to talk about that a little bit today as well. Communicate the narrative of a division's strengths, right? When you are out in the community and you are sharing who you are, that's how you change the narrative, right? Last time I was here, remember we talked about how we didn't really necessarily even applaud that data. That's within your control. It's within your power to change the narrative, right? Advocate for the division, promote the good, build public trust. We're going to do this having crystal clear norms and protocols. That'll happen today. Build relationships internally and externally. That we'd be, you said you'd be a high-performing board if you were efficient and had better role and responsibility clarity, which we'll focus on today. The trust and collaboration, united front. You know, so it's what I want you to see from this is that when asked, what do you need to be? You know, right? The answers are always already in the room. Yeah. So you know what it is. Now our work is, okay, now what do we need to do to get there, right? Because when I asked the question, everything that we are talking about, all of those behaviors, these were all of your words that, you know, when I spoke to each person and when we were in the room. We know what it looks like. We got to figure out how to start doing it. Easier said than done, right? But you got to be really intentional and really committed to doing it and not just saying it. So, yeah. So that leads us to those chapters, right? I know you're probably, how many of you were like wanted to read wait, let me ask the question this way. How many of you read the whole book? Who read the whole book? Oh, okay. I thought I was for sure you're going to be like, I couldn't put it down. So I resist the urge to go ahead because I do want to take us. I kind of want to really do the digging into it, right? And so I'm going to assign each time like only 2 chapters and maybe some additional reading for the purposes of really being reflective and honing in, right? Because it's a short read and you could easily read it in one foul swoop, right? But your charge was to read those 2 chapters and to summarize your thinking about the content of the chapters and then reflect on some of the ideas that are found in them. And then make those connections to what you're reading to your work as board members so we can have some discussion. So I always want to build into our time together some discussion around those concepts. And then I've kind of developed our agenda around those concepts, right? So that moves us forward. And it's the authors, their intent, Campbell and Fullen, their intent was for this to kind of be a study that a board would go through, right? And so there is actually a workbook, a facilitator's workbook that I'm using that I'm not giving to you all that helps to drive what those discussions will look like. Does that make sense? So just know that that this is intended for board members to have in hand and to read in time with some behind the scenes facilitation of driving the agenda of your governance work. So that's how we're doing this. So we're doing like a book study, right? And like a learning protocols that are going to move us through the text. So don't go ahead if you can resist the urge of not going ahead of our reading, that'd be great. All right. So let's talk about it. So those first 2 chapters really focus on what governance is. And so here's the definition of governance. This is on page 15. It says it's the process where the direction of the organization is set. Right? Direction of the organization is set. The structure is established and accountability, both fiscal and programmatic, is assured. Oftentimes I think boards think that their responsibility just lies in policy and fiscal responsibility and that kind of thing. That's just part of it, right? It says governance is the connection between communities and professionals, between policy and application, and between strategy and tactics. And generally, governance is about defining the what of the organization, and administration is focused on the how policy gets implemented. And that's important because I think that, just some of the things that I've witnessed, and we'll talk about more, is that you all might get focused on the how, which honestly is in the weeds and should not be the board's work. You guys are the what. The one person who you're responsible for, the superintendent, she's responsible for the how. right? And so we're going to talk about role clarity and really begin to disaggregate that. But I think that that's an important distinction I want us to make, is to think about defining the what, which is your work, and then allowing the authority of the superintendent to go back to her cabinet and to develop the how. Of course, with accountability to report back to you, right? The progress of it, and here's how we're doing it, and here's the results of what we're doing, and here are the measures, and here's progress made to date. So we're not saying that she's not accountable, right? She still maintains accountability to you, but you allow her the freedom and flexibility, the autonomy of the how. Yes.
I liked how in the book they described the difference between the two. They used the metaphor of rowing, like that's steering and rowing.
Hold on.
Okay. I have not seen the slide.
We're going
For the
there.
record, I have not seen the slide.
Yeah, I love that, right?
I was like, that's a perfect metaphor.
It is,
to use to
right?
describe that.
And so there's two, that one, and we're gonna talk about that in a second, so hold that. But it's this is where you all are, right? That critical fork in the road. So I love this graphic that, I don't know what page it's on. 17. There it is, yeah. So it's, you can either be a collection of individuals, each person with his or her own agenda, own vision, seeing his or her main function as voting on issues with little coherence or consistency, or you can be a cohesive, unified team working together to create this common vision driven by shared moral imperative. I want you all to look at this graphic and tell me who you are.
Out loud? Now? Oh, you want us to say it out loud?
Yeah.
We're A.
We turned left when we should have gone right.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you saw this image, what was the first thought that came to your mind? What was the first thought and what was the first feeling?
I thought that we're definitely an A, but I'm hopeful that we will become a B. It made me feel hopeful that we could.
Another thought and a feeling.
I think I thought A, but I was idealistic to feel maybe we could be B, but I do understand that while our role on the board is for us to work collectively, but I think because we're an elected school board, I think a lot of political stuff gets in the system, and you can't deny that. I mean, we can't be naive to think that it doesn't exist because we are elected. And so I think sometimes that pushes us to A, the political piece, that you can't deny because it does exist, not just in Norfolk, but all over the country with elected school boards. So sometimes I worry about that piece, and how do you maneuver through that in trying to be a B? Does that, I don't know. Is that
No, it does make sense.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't to me. I would like to ask a clarifying question.
Go ahead.
So I see there's internal and external politics. So I don't see I'm trying to understand what you're saying, so I'm just trying to share some perspective. So I'm not seeing the national politics necessarily intruding our ability to be a B team, be a B diagram. It seems like there's more internal to me, but I want to understand, are you in agreement with that? Is that what you're saying, or what do you mean by politics?
Well, I think it could be.
Is impeding us from being a B?
I think it could be local politics, and it could be state politics, or even national. But I'm saying it exists, and we got to be able to maneuver around that. Whether it be local, it can be local, it can be internal, local, city, state, or national. That what I'm talking about, we have to maneuver through to get to a B versus staying in A. And things that are going on, agendas, things that are going, that we have to maneuver through that as individual board members, and some of the politics behind it.
I'm sorry, because I would think that would bring us together. So can you be more specific? Do you have an example of what type of politics?
So here's how I was interpreting it. Let me see if I'm right? When I think about it, like as an individual, if you have to run for office, if you're up for re-election and you've got to be out there campaigning, but others do not have to, as an individual, that's going to drive that person's behaviors, right? And so that can create some of this individual agenda piece. I think that's how I heard it. And one thing that I think I want to clarify too about that I thought about is it doesn't say that you lose your individuality when you become a cohesive, unified team. And I think that, so you know what I'm saying? So that might be a struggle for some, like a rub for some too, saying I just got to be all on board with everything that this board says and we got to sing Kumbaya all the time. No, I think there's space to be an individual, to have individual perspectives, how you bring them to the group, right? And how you come to consensus and agreement or whatever. Even if you don't, you know, if you have those conversations, you still ultimately, externally appear to be a unified team of people who are working together. So I don't want people to feel like they lose themselves, they lose their individuality, you know, and then we're saying, oh, for me to be a B, I can't have any parts of my individual self because that would make me an A. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead, there's a couple of hands up.
I was just going to share with Adele that like the full end describes it as like competing power struggles. And so I don't mean to speak for Dr. Rowson, but perhaps that could give you a little more perspective on that. It's people, it's all of you, you know, you have your constituents, and there's certain things that, for example, that your constituents might want versus what Dr. Rowson's may want. And then when you come here, you're competing to say, we're going to early school start times, whatever your constituents are advocating for. So that creates this, you know, you have these competing interests, which causes conflict.
I guess I don't really take that perspective when I come in here. I'm thinking about the entire district, and since that's the value that we've learned that we want, or we've publicly said we want to adopt as the consensus of the board, is that I think that I guess my impression is that any one of us that's bringing in our constituents' concerns is, like we talked about earlier, giving space to something that's in our community that should be considered equally by all 7 of the representatives that were elected by our city. So I am not seeing that as much as I need to do this because they don't always know better, but we do need to have a conversation about these different issues so that it's put out in the public, because I look at every opportunity as a chance to educate on what's going on, and I don't necessarily look at it as political pull. So that might be why I'm interested more in learning about your perspective on why you talked about the politics of it. So.
And I think to your point about, like, even if in your district there's different competing interests, you'll still see in the B it says driven by a shared moral imperative, right? And so if as a district your shared moral imperative is going to be, like, the filter we're going to use is that it's what's best for kids or it's what's best for all students in the district, you still bring that forward, but you all run it through the filter of, now how might that same thing benefit the rest of the district? The example I always give people, sometimes they think, but we don't think about necessarily, okay, so you know, like ramps, right? Ramps outside of buildings. They were placed there for what reason?
To help people who can't walk upstairs.
Are they the only ones that use ramps?
Strollers.
Yeah.
No. Or else.
People who don't want to go up the steps.
Not all use ramps, right? Now, yeah, right. So they were originally intended for wheelchairs and for access for those that have handicaps, so we all still use those ramps.
Yes.
Now, so the idea of developing ramps came from a need. And so even if that need is only in your district, you say, we need ramps, right? We can't say, well, no, we don't need ramps over here. Or we don't say that only in my district, you guys don't call them districts, right? What are they called? Wards, right? Wards. That the ramps can only be used in my ward. What we're saying is, like, what's for the greater good of all, and where are we creating access, right, for others? And we're not limiting it to just those folks who are in wheelchairs, because mothers with strollers might use them. Folks who don't want to take the stairs might use them, right? But it's that shared moral imperative. We're trying to create access, right? How we go about that is not limiting. And so you should still be able to bring those different perspectives. In our ward, we would benefit from more ramps. That's fine, right? We're not going to argue about, no, you don't get ramps. I don't get ramps. I don't have ramps. We don't have anybody in a wheelchair in my building. I don't need ramps, right? You see, like, I hope that's a good example, because I want people to think about the things we put in place and thinking about how it's not to limit further, it's to create greater access. And so that's why the wheelchair ramp example is helpful here, because, you know, if this idea of having individual needs, that need may be a shared need, but unless you're able to bring it forward to the whole group to have that conversation and say, how does this tie into our shared moral imperative, then you'll find value of it for others, right? So you should have voice to be able to bring it, but sometimes it may feel political, right? It may feel like it's, you know, it's only something that's being expressed in one place. You have to resist the urge in this room to not see it that way.
So when I saw this example, I thought of it as, yes, we each have our own agenda, but you can flip it to say we each have our own strengths. And if we have a good coach, then that coach can align who will sit where on the boat in order to maximize the strengths so that we win the race. And I just think of it as, you know, my children's sports team. So there might be some individuals who swim a certain event that they love and they're really good and they want to get that fast time, but the coach says, no, you need to swim here because this is where you're going to be the best benefit for the relay team. And that swimmer can either say yes or they're going to forfeit, and who loses at the end? The team, and then the relay team, and then the whole group together. And so that's where I see us, that there are so many strengths here, but we don't want to listen to the coach. And if we just step back and listen, then everybody gets to be in the limelight to hold up the trophy and to do all of the wonderful things that comes with success. But we just have to take a step back and focus on, okay, let's listen to where we need to maximize our strengths so that we can achieve that goal. And it's hard.
It is. And it's the perfect segue to this, right? Because if you were all grabbing at that steering wheel, what happens? You're going to crash, right?
Yes.
Right.
But when you think about the rowing, you've got one person that's screaming out, row,
Yes.
row, 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 and everybody's, right, you're all at this, all in sync, right? That synchronicity is what helps propel the movement forward. If everybody's paddling in all different directions or trying to grab this one steering wheel, we're all 8 people grabbing one steering wheel, you're gonna crash, right? And if we're all rowing in different ways, different directions, we're not gonna propel forward. And that's why I love the steering versus rowing example too, because I think that that's what we want to get to. We want to get to the place where, yes, and you can use the example in 2 different ways, right? It can be that the board might steer the organization, but Dr. Birdsong and her cabinet
That's how I saw
are
it.
rowing. Yeah, I see it both ways, right? Yeah.
That's how I
So
feel.
I being that I do dragon boating in a very similar boat, they flip and they flounder, and it's not necessarily cohesive all the time.
But when they are in sync, what happens?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I love the way you described that. When they're in sync, it's amazing.
We want you guys to be amazing.
Yeah, because we are.
Yeah.
So I also kind of looked at that in this respect, that you've got to want to be in the boat together.
Yeah.
So when I
I can
saw
get a
the
dragon
other,
boat here.
that you got to want to be in the boat. And when I kind of looked at that and at the other picture, it was kind of like, you have all these, yes, they're out there, and then, they're together, but you got to want to do that. In order to make that happen, there's got to be something. And that's where I always hear this, we've heard it, the will of the board. But it gets into this thing. I think sometimes when folks hear the will of the board, I think it sometimes come back, if you're not in the majority or whatever the will was, dealing with what that minority looks like, and sometimes. And because, we've heard in governance training, well, even if you didn't vote in favor of something for the division, you're still held responsible to support the overall mission of the vision. And I think sometimes that doesn't really connect, because then it feels like sometimes there's that line in the sand, and then there's that, I'm going to drive it over here because I feel that this is what it needs to be, and there's that it doesn't get back to wanting to be in the same boat, and that's what.
Even the narrative around, well, because people see how you vote publicly, and then if you take that out into the community, and you're like, well, you saw I didn't vote for that, so that's what they're doing. Then you're not a cohesive board. You immediately appear to be the other graphic. Oh, I'm clicking on the wrong thing. You appear to be A, right? Because I didn't vote for it, and so therefore I'm not supporting it. And so my narrative in the community is, well, I didn't vote for it. They did. and then you lose sight of you're part of the day, right? And so there's already then a narrative created around we're separate, we're figure A. And I think when we get to the norming activity, we're going to do in a little bit, one of the norms should be, right, something around, we can wordsmith it later, but some language around that even when one does not vote for something, right, that they can,
They can support.
they can support it. They can be unified in the messaging, right? Discussions around how we got to it stay in. The decision goes out. That what's forward speaking. And it doesn't imply that anybody should be disingenuous or fake in the public, but in the room, you had those conversations and you said, okay, I didn't vote for this, I didn't agree with this, and here's why. We have all that. You put all that on the table, but ultimately, here's how I can support that. Right? I think that might be the missing piece in some of the dialogue that needs to occur. You got to make space for that, though. You got to create the space for that to happen. You know, creating those brave spaces means that I should be okay saying, I'm not voting for this and here's why. Here's my struggle with it. And maybe even the second part of that conversation is, for me to support this publicly, here's what I need, right? Like, so you know what I'm saying? So you create an opportunity for some of that negotiation to even happen. That has to happen behind closed doors. So those things can't play out publicly because that's what makes it difficult for the public to then trust you all.
Just to follow up that one, because I wanted to use that earlier analogy. So one of the things that in my fraternity, we talk about an alpha. So you think about alpha males, you know, they're high flying. Everybody has an opinion. And if you've ever been fraternity, sorority meeting, whatever, people have an opinion. But the one thing that we're taught is it's about how do you operate in a way of educating and informing your fellow brother or sorority, whatever, over to your opinion. You know, we have a vote, and once we have the vote, it's done. But there's that process of communicating. It's not just necessarily going to be in that meeting at that time, but there may be some relationship outside that you're communicating and trying to get to some consensus so that when you get to the vote, like you said, almost behind, you know, what do you do behind, you know, at one-on-one to build a relationship so that when it's public, even if you don't support it, it's not, you know, it's not a big gotcha type thing.
Good example is like just recently in, you know, politics, right? That the whole infrastructure bill, whatever it was, and they thought it was gone, right? And then lo and behold, Chuck Schumer and Andrew Manchin, they were having conversations. We didn't know about it, but when it came forward, it was for the greater good. And I think that that's a really good lesson, right, in terms of, you know, we're not always going to agree. We're not going to always be on the same side of issues. But if we can come together, if we can have the dialogues and say, okay, what's going to get us to the greater good? Like, and that doesn't need to be done publicly. That doesn't need to be done for all to see. Because then the story becomes, did you see Chuck Schumer and Andrew and Manchin, everything was fighting, right? Versus the, wow, I don't know what the conversation was, but they came back with a result, and they had a unified message around it. Now, of course, it's rare to see that kind of thing, but I thought that's a really good example of, you know, what this kind of work requires. Sometimes it requires you to have that, you got to have the knockout, drag-outs, you know, behind the scenes, right? And then come back with the positive narrative while, you know, it took some time and, you know, we had some struggle with it, but here's where we are as a board. And if you can draw that clear through line to, here's how this benefits each student in Norfolk Public Schools, there you have it, right?
Yeah.
But you have to go through the process. Like, that's what I get frustrated with, is I feel like the process is cut, it's not there.
Yeah.
And so then it's just a split, like,
And
okay,
you have,
just
but you don't have
decide.
this, you haven't created the space for the process. You don't have the norms for the process, right? If you have the norms, we don't really follow them. So to your point, yeah, it's frustrating because those things are not in place, and so all the other things are happening. The public stuff, the you know, the I'll use the term backbiting, right? And those things, people see that stuff, right? And that doesn't mean that didn't happen with Schumer and Manchin. I'm sure it did, right? But if that's not the story that we're telling right now. We're telling the story of this bill getting passed, and I think that that's what you have to be careful of: is what's the ultimate story, right, that the community sees, hears, and can then also amplify, right? And if it's a negative story versus the, I don't know how they did it, but they got it done, and I benefit from it, the kids benefit from it, that's the story we want out there. So we got to put the process, to your point, put the processes in place, create the space for these conversations to happen, but also have that mutual respect for one another, so that even after the knockdown dragouts, and you come back and they do the joint press conference with Manchin and Schumer, they're patting each other in the back like they probably were stabbing each other, behind the scenes. We didn't see all that. But when they got to the public place, it was, here's what we did. It wasn't even like I did this part. I made him get along. No, that wasn't. It was a unifying message. And I think that would go a long way on this board if that narrative was this unifying message. And so we just have to do the work to get to that place. Yeah.
I think that what happens to us also a lot, I don't know if more hiding my face than anything because I got a few zaps on it this morning. I think that, and I personally am involved in doing this myself. I'm not pointing the finger here as much as anywhere else, but I think that we take it personally when people don't agree with our vote or actions that we take, and I think that then it drags over to the next item, so that it's almost adversarial no matter which way you are. And I'm as guilty as anyone, but I think board-wise that's been a problem for us. It's unfortunate that we don't have board training in place that addresses real-day things. We went to some board training when we first came on board, but it was pretty boring. It loses, I'm ADHD, so it didn't take much to lose me. But I would get up and actually leave and do some walks around the stairs where we were in the place we were being trained in because I couldn't hold on with my attention to it. But I see a lot of, my words to myself lately have been, be nice to everybody. I've been making an effort. I'm not always nice. And so I've been really trying to be nice to everyone, even if they've just voted, even if I've just really lost a vote, and that happens to me often. Yeah. So I think that that's something that's really blocked us, and it's kind of built over time when we disagree on big issues that I'm not quite sure how to address, but that's something that I think we certainly need to keep our focus on some too, is that we need to be able to have our disagreement about a thing and then we vote on it and then we're still okay with each other.
Yeah, and that's a muscle that has to be built, right? Like because our first instinct, that's not our first instinct. Like even when we started this meeting, right? If and again, you have to practice this, right? But it could easily have occurred in that exchange from when we first started the meeting, before we even got started the meeting, that could have derailed Mr. Jordan from wanting to participate, right? Because now he's feeling some kind of way. I'm just using an example. feeling some kind of way, right? Feeling some kind of way about what happened with Carlos, right? And then I think Ms. Martin also had some feelings about it, right? And so Dr. Martin. And so what we want to do is that's a self-regulating piece too, right? I'm not going to take this personally.
It is.
I'm not going to allow this to derail the way that I'm showing up in this meeting. And maybe we need a norm around that too,
Yeah, and that's something I felt that I've been working on, and it takes a lot of work. But that's something that I've been just on my own. I've been trying to be a pleasant person to everyone.
Well, again, I'm finding this very interesting because I'm not holding hard feelings about votes. I think people have to vote the way we're all very passionate in our positions, and I think that we need to vote with that passion. But I think it does go back to the process. Is that I think it's the things that happen before and after the vote that are really the problems. It's not the votes themselves. And we talked, you even said the last time that it's okay to have dissenting votes, right? I mean, we shouldn't be expected to vote 100% together 100% of the time. So anyways, I just wanted to share that because I'm learning more about if people are getting mad. I guess people are getting mad about not voting together. It's not something that I particularly am holding as a high price item, I guess.
One of the things that we would oftentimes, with my staff, I would oftentimes do is ask, now what's the parking lot conversation? What's the texting conversation? Because that's part of what's happening behind the scenes that people aren't yet ready to share. And so having the opportunity to bring people together to say, all right, this is what we've agreed to. Now, before we go out and share this publicly, what's going to be that parking lot conversation that we need to talk about here before it becomes public? And sometimes that's the challenging piece, especially when we're looking at voting, because voting is different from consensus. Voting says there's a winner and a loser. Consensus says we're in agreement on this. I can support this. It may not be every single point that is raised or is brought forward, but when we leave, I'm going to be in support of this. And going back to one of the things that you said, Valda, with, here's when you get to a place where you're trying to reach consensus and not everybody is on board, and so you ask, here's what I need to make it work. I would add to that, here's what I need to make it work for each student or for each child in Norfolk Public Schools, because then it takes away from here's what I need to work. I need it to work for the students. And so how am I going to do that? What's going to be my contribution to making sure that this is something that is successful for every student?
Because right now, because right now you see it as, going back to the example before, of if people see it as, well, this is what will work in my ward, right? And other people receive that you're only in it for you and your ward, right? Which is different than saying, if I have ramps in my ward, everybody can use them, right? You see what I'm saying? So and I love that suggestion for the STEM of, here's what I would need to get on board with this. Here's what I would need for the students in Norfolk Public Schools to get on board with this. That's a whole different conversation, right? Right.
I think we have to bring it to the table as it's coming up from my ward, and this is a perspective, and then bring it to the table and say, is everyone else experiencing this too? Is this a district need or is it a ward need? Yeah. And I think this is the venue that we need to have those kind of discussions.
And that's just shaping your conversations, right?
But just by me bringing it up, I shouldn't be judged that I'm trying to just advocate for my ward.
No, but that goes back to how people are receiving this.
It doesn't even make sense in this city because wards and school districts the districting's all over the place, so we're all responsible for a piece of, all for all.
Yep.
And then I think it's interesting, we talk about the ramp, because some years ago, and being in special education, I understood the whole philosophy of, schools getting ramps and for everybody to have accessibility. But then I said, all these years without ramps, how do we get bringing, as a teacher, I brought all this stuff on carts and all of that before ramps were required. I was like, how did I do that? And how ramps made that possible, even to just cart things in. I mean, even though, I don't have an accessibility, but getting carts in a building with 20 steps. I was in a very old school, they had 20 steps to get in there. I said, how did I get all that stuff in that building on a cart? I had a cart of stuff. And when ramps came about, I said, yes, it helped make accessible, but it also opened up so many other doors for things that happen that needs a ramp.
Yeah, it made it easier for all.
Yes,
right.
It did.
And I think that's the conversation. So and I'm going to keep picking on. So if Adele says, in my ward, this would make it great for the students in my ward, everybody else should not receive it as she's only in it for her ward. It should be, how might that be beneficial to my ward as well? Yes. How might that be beneficial to all?
For teachers, for staff, for students who need it.
It's the approach to that, right? It's like how we respond to it. And you do that more effectively if you have personal relationships that are not grounded in judgment, right? Because if you're already got your claws out, because here's Adele again with her what works in her ward versus we hadn't thought about that. How might that benefit all of our wards? How might that help us to get to our mission, which is that we want to make sure that we're providing access to all students? And then it becomes what a great suggestion versus here she is with her own agenda, right? So even in this graphic, this fork in the road, it's really about the framing, right? Like how we come at our discussions, how we approach each other in our discussions. So you don't lose your individual interests, right? So I think that the fork piece, right? It's not, I don't want it to be like, oh, well, I can't be my individual self. I think that what they should do, and I should suggest it to the authors, it's just me, those circles that are in the A, they should still be circles, but in the B. Does that make sense? Like if there were marbles, we're not saying, oh, the marbles must be the same color. We're saying you bring your red, your green, your blue, your orange, whatever marble, you be your individual color, but now we're all in this one dish together as individuals. And I think that's my modification to the graphic.
Draw it in.
I know, right?
Get the crayons.
Yeah, because it's not like we're saying you can't have an individual need, thought, idea, or concept that stems from what's important in your particular ward, but we're saying that we bring it and we as a board, we think about it as in a collective. Hope that helps. Yeah. Okay.
But all of that goes back to trust too. Because when Adele makes, a comment about what she needs in her ward, if we don't trust Adele's motives, then we're going to think, here she goes again,
Yep. Yep.
trying to advocate for her ward or something like that.
And that kind of speaks to the kind of norms that you create too. What's my positive presupposition around this? Or am I coming at it and going back to one of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of curiosity and judgment? Am I already judging because maybe in the past this has happened, but how do I leave that past part out and go into this with, now, how can we all benefit? What's in it for all of us, and how do we make that work?
That's the hard part, right? Because we keep saying this work is so grounded in relationships.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. Like, even when I did the one-on-ones with everybody, people were like, this happened to me last year. I'm still mad at so-and-so for this, right? And I know it's not human nature. It's not our immediate instinct to put stuff down and leave it in the rear view. But I'm asking you all, you gotta put some of this stuff down and leave it in the rear view, because the only way we move forward is if we say, Carlos made me mad last year, but I'm gonna get over it, right? Or I felt like I was shut down when this conversation happened, last school year, but I'm gonna get over it. So I think that, and that takes work, that's hard, I get it, but I think that if we're really gonna change what this dynamic is, like, we almost have to say, we have to create norms so those things don't happen again. Remember last time we talked about, like, what was the harm? How do we repair the harm? And then we want to put in place a norm so that harm does not occur again. But once that's in place, you can't keep talking about the harm, right? Because then it becomes, we're going to hold each other and myself accountable to our new norm, which we're going to develop today. So some of those harms that were in the past that we've talked about, we're going to actually develop norms around those, like some language around what does it look like, what should it look like, not remember we did the plus delta and we challenge you to do the language with the verbs of what it should look like. So instead of it being, Carlos is not going to take privilege, it'll be, right, as a board, we recognize that. And put the positive language, the verbiage and the actions that align to the behaviors you want to see, so that it eliminates conflict. That's hard stuff. It takes time, right? And once we do that, then it's how do we hold each other accountable to it? Because it's not just going to be a piece of paper. It's not going to be like, we have norms, and then we don't follow them. It's going to be, now we hold each other accountable and say, it's saying our norm around blah, blah, blah states. So I think that we're not living that norm right now. Not, you didn't follow the norms, right? Right? It's even in how we communicate to each other when we hold each other accountable. Those are the things that don't damage relationships, It's like families, right? I mean, like I am youngest, I don't know if you know this, I'm youngest of 6 children. All girls, 1 boy. The reason why I talk fast, like, I've actually slowed down quite a bit. You probably know this because you know me for years. I used to be a super fast talker, like, blah, 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 right? And moved to the South, and people were like, what is she talking about? Because I had to slow it down. But my sisters, we range from 72 to 53, okay? And I would enter a room and knew that I had to spit it out, little girl, right? Because ain't nobody listening to you. And so I was always like, I have to go in there and say it real fast. And that was a family dynamic. And of course, I'm an adult now, I've had to work on that. But if the dynamic is such that you've always experienced people in the same way, it's really hard to not see them that way. So I'm always having to remind my sisters now that, yes, I'm the youngest, but I'm also in my 50s and I'm grown. Like, cut it out, right? Because they still want to tell me what to do. They still want to boss me. And so we have to reprogram people, right? And reprogram the way that people experience us and the way that we experience them. Sometimes that requires holding them accountable, right? So when my reminders to them that I'm an adult, I don't I'm an adult, because then they'd be like, no, you're not. Not right now, you're not, right?
Now we have to tell.
No, I tell us. If you tell us you're grown, you're not grown, right? But if I can hold them, like, we don't have norms. We kind of do, right? Not written norms, but if I can hold them to, hey, I need you to respect me as an adult, and I and recognize that I'm a parent too, or what the case is. They receive that. So you know what, she's right. My bad, V. I'm sorry. It's just I get into big sister mode, but it's the way that I articulate it to them, right? And so we're able to recover from it immediately, versus the I'm not going to send you a nasty text message and who you think you are, la 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 la. And I think that's relationship. That's what's our foundation needs to be in this room, right? Relationship. All right. Good. All right. So on page 2, this is a quote. One of the quotes about governance is the basic function of the organization, integral part of the system, setting the direction of the district, assuring the achievement of strategic goals and moral imperative, holding the district accountable, and providing leadership to the community. right? That's one of the early on quotes. I think I shared this one last time too. And so this is where we are. We're at that basic function. We're at the place of really saying, you know, how do we move this system forward? How do we set the direction, right? And then how do we make sure that it's aligned to strategic goals, which in this case will be a strategic plan, the shared moral imperatives we talked about last time, and then the accountability. But what I love here is providing leadership to the community. Yes, we should be student-centered, but, you know, students are the community as well, right? And I think that how you talk to your community, how you get input from the community, you know, how you use said input, all of that is what should be what drives this work as well, right? So, you know, if at the end of the day you can say, we did what's best for kids and we did what's best for our community, right? No one can fault you for that, right? Because you're always grounded in being able to say, this is a decision that the board made. Here's how it benefits our students. Here's how it benefits our families. Here's how it benefits our stakeholders. Or it may even be that you're saying, here's how it benefits the majority of our students, or the students who are most needy, right? Because we need to be able to articulate that to communities and have them understand that too. This decision was made because what we found was that the way the policy currently existed, it further marginalized our students of poverty, or it further impacted our second language learners, right? And we should be okay communicating that. Like, here's why, and that's providing leadership to the community, because then they have that messaging too. So they don't walk away with a feeling like, well, they only did that for the poor kids, they only did it for the black kids, they only did, you know what I'm saying, that kind of thing. You all have to be, as a board, also be comfortable with that language and creating accountability around why you made the decisions and being able to share that publicly. The superintendent must see the work of the board as central to the success of the district. Similarly, it is equally critical for the board to have confidence in the expertise of the superintendent. I want this to marinate for a minute, okay? Because I think that this is that big part of that bridging that needs to happen. And I'm gonna surface an example, because we got edits to the strategic plan that we're working on. But I saw, and I don't know where it came from. I'm less concerned about whose edits it were. But when we're crossing out of the superintendent's letter to the community, I'm thinking like that. I've never seen that. Like and I actually went and Googled. I was hard pressed to find a strategic plan online for any district that did not have a letter from the superintendent in front of it. And so that, as a board, you all felt like the superintendent's voice wasn't necessary to the strategic plan, speaks to not having the confidence in the expertise of the superintendent.
I don't remember this. What happened? Did someone?
Yeah, it's crossed out. Yeah, that's neither here nor there. It's just an example of what I'm talking about. A board that has confidence in the expertise of their superintendent just doesn't feel like the superintendent should not have a letter in the front of a strategic plan that's developed under their superintendency, right? And so that was very telling for me, because it speaks to how there's work to be done in trusting and having confidence in the expertise of the superintendent. Yeah.
If I may also point out something too, so I think that's also a really good example of where we worked in isolation to provide edits, or suggested recommendations without having the ability to collaborate and be unified, because, the first thing is we're looking at each other like, who did that? And it's like,
or some of you hadn't even seen it, right?
Did I do that? Yeah. I was like, no, and so we're all already here trying to make judgment on that, whether right or wrong. That's not the issue. But I think that at the core of that is that, we didn't collaborate on it. We didn't say, hey, I didn't say, hey, Dr. Martin, or, whoever, or hey, board colleagues, what do you think about this? And kind of come to an agreement. We did not have that. So instead, now, we've just individual edits have been sent along. You're probably working on a draft that may or may not be inclusive of those edits, depending on. And so it's like, I think that also creates issues among this board, because it's not a collaborative process.
Right.
Now-
It goes
And that's back to the process, right?
Goes back to process, absolutely. And I will say this, I've seen many strategic plans that have a letter from the board and one from the superintendent. And usually the ones that I got, because I was really curious, I was Googling all kinds of school districts across the country. I was like, let me try to find one that does not have a superintendent letter. Couldn't find one. But there were some that had a letter from the board, and it was very supportive of the work of the district. It was celebratory, and it said how they got behind the superintendent. And then there was another page that was the superintendent's letter. So even that, like, I just thought this is one example that I wanted to surface for you all about this idea of confidence and expertise of the board, of the superintendent. If it's just a unilateral, let's just cross it out, like, let's not give her voice, that's a problem.
Right.
Yeah,
But again, I think that judgment is there without understanding why the individual may have crossed it out. It may have been, to enhance it. It may have been to be inclusive of the board. So I think that judgment piece is still there because we haven't had the collaborative discussion. So.
Yeah, and I'm the one that did it, and if I was asked, I would have given context to it. So I just pulled up my notes as I was looking at it, and part of it was around some of the points that had been made earlier about what is it that we were trying to send collectively, and what was it that was in the message. And so I too looked up different strategic plans and saw both pieces of it. But if we're asked to give individual feedback, if you have a question, if you ask, then that context can be given. I think as part of our process, we don't do well with collaboration. We 2x2s or 1x1s and so forth, which breaks down to me the opportunity for the board as a whole to have discussions around what is it that we're prioritizing, what is it that we see, and then passing that on to have it then reflected in the information that we received.
So two things keep coming up: process, but also trust, right? Trust in relationships, trust in the superintendent, right? Trust in each other. Yeah.
It's both ways.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, because on the onset, on surface level, that seems, I keep hearing process, but the process, even in that strategic plan, was to give additional time for board members to have a conversation. And the only reason why it went beyond that was that there was timing. How much more time are we going to give this? And so any additional board members who had recommendations, submit those recommendations and submit them in for the administration to have. We only got 2 people on the board who submitted additional recommendations, so those recommendations went to the administration. So when I hear process, I mean, we've had a collaborative open, had an entire work session to add that on so that we could do that, to bring that collective voice, but there also goes back to that trust piece. So when we leave out of the room, the additional time that's required in that to be able to bring ideas, put them together, and send them over to the administration. But then I also think that that's one of the things that we have to repair, and also do the line. So, if you saw an X or whatever else on a line down there on a statement, was there some additional context written on that other than just a red X? So I think that's where it's so signals sometimes we say that may not be intentional, but because of some of the past hurts and things like that, it can be be received differently.
And I think the other thing you said that was key was recommendations. I think that just because someone crosses it out or whatever the case is, doesn't mean that has to be the ultimate decision. So I think you all need we need to think about those norms as well, that if it's a recommendation, that's one thing. If it's because I crossed it out, that means that this shouldn't be in there, and then I'm going to be mad if it is in there, right? That's going to just cause further breakdown. So I think we have to think about those pieces as well. I'm sorry.
You can go first, and then I'll follow.
Go ahead.
Yeah, her hand was up
Yeah,
first.
so I think this is a great example and topic and relevant. So, in that, we left that meeting, with clear, here, get me your, to all the board, provide your feedback on the strategic plan, and provide it by, a certain date and time. And, two board members responded, and
I had responded during the meeting, so just so that we're all clear, my feedback came during the meeting.
There were 3 board members.
There were 3 board members who had additional,
Right,
Dr. Martin added
And
something
Dr.
during the
Martin.
meeting too.
right, and we had that
Yeah,
dialogue.
but did.
Discussion, yeah, we had that discussion.
Yeah,
But
we had a
that, yeah, we
discussion.
had
did.
discussion, but then anything additional came after that, and that was provided. And also because, with, again, time to have that discussion, it was also a factor. And so I guess my point is that then there were requests to then kind of see what some of those recommendations are, from the full board. And what I had interpreted was that there was more feedback being collected, and that's why we had kind of pushed that discussion from today, which is what I think was originally part of the plan, was to come back today and have that discussion. So I think, again, back to, as an example of, processes that we think are in place in one meeting and they get changed in between, and then we come back with a different set of expectations, I think that impacts our trust. And
What, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was gonna say, what would have been, let's use the same example. Would it have been, well, let me get back up for a second, because there's something that comes to mind. Do you think it's a good use of the board's time to be wordsmithing a strategic plan?
Oh, it wasn't wordsmithing so much.
I thought I'm just speaking of because like I said, I only saw, as far as written recommendations, I know what I provided. And some were out of feedback and discussion that we did have in person, especially around, the physical and social, emotional piece. And if you would see my edits, I included some of the input, Dr. Gabriel, that we were having good dialogue about. And so that was just a way of writing down, like what we had discussed. And so it wasn't necessarily that these were mine alone. It was inclusive of what I captured from the discussion that we did have. And so it wasn't, I don't think we were, and there were some additions in there that weren't in there at all, at least from my, additional additions, because we talked about, let's talk about safety and security, right? We talked about, we want this in there, but none of us came up with an exact, what it might look like. So, I did some thinking, I did some research, I did some, and I came back with a recommendation. And it was just that, a recommendation. You guys can say, I don't think that sounds good, whatever. But it was rooted in the discussion that we had in our meeting, where we didn't come up with, this is what it could look like. It was just that we need to have secure schools in here somehow, some way. And so I provided a suggestion. And so, it wasn't that just because we didn't say it in the meeting, therefore, those of us that provided additional feedback afterwards, that's, what I'm hearing and the story I'm telling myself is that that's a negative. And it's not. It was rooted in that discussion, but it was to, like you said, it's a working document.
Yeah.
It's something that we're coming back to.
So I think, so to your point, I think a process piece, because that's my second part of the question was going to be, so what could that have looked like? Here's our working draft. Please provide feedback, written or orally, and leaving space on the agenda for the oral discussion. If there's additional written feedback by this date, building in time for some discussion around that written feedback. Maybe
Yes.
that's right. So that
That's
people
what I'm
can,
asking for, right.
people can
Right.
say, here's why I made the suggestion, da 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 da. I know you're going to tell me that probably happened, so hold on,
Yeah.
hold that thought, right? And then coming to consensus in the room about which of those changes are going to
Right.
gonna move forward. Which of those recommendations? Because again, they're only recommendations, right? And if your recommendation is not one that moves forward, you're okay with it because you had an opportunity to explain
Exactly.
why and that kind of thing. Now, Carlos, did that happen?
Yes, so the last thing we had was a monitoring schedule. And so to allow time, and as I had written in the email, recommendations for the administration to consider, because even all our conversations and what we're doing, it's to go back and to allow their wheelhouse, because they're the professionals, to craft it and to bring back to the board recommendations. I also have to point out the fact that we were very inclusive to try to ensure every board member's recommendations and feedback were included. Mr. Jordan submitted his information. We didn't realize Ms. Messine was out of the country and that she had submitted her information, and it was bouncing back. So even when she reached out, and when I found out that she could get there in there, I ensured that her information was included. So this whole thing, I want, just, we're in these time spaces and everything else, and in order to keep things moving, we also have to allow this flexibility sometimes in what the schedule has. It hasn't changed what we're doing. We're still going to have a conversation. The administration's still going to come back to us. We just changed the date that it's going to happen, so that they had enough time for the administration, the professionals, to take the recommendations and to craft it in something that can be presented back to the board. So I just wanted to add that context to there, because, again, I respect the fact that that may be what may be perceived and what she received there, but I'm also wanted to think, I wanted folks to see, because I've tried to be intentional on emails and things out there to kind of talk about next steps and where we are. I'm not perfect, but I try to do that because it's important for us to be along and to be rowing in that boat together.
Now, many of the recommendations were accepted, and so there's editing that's occurring, so that your input is being incorporated. But I think one of the things that you all have to reconcile as part of the way that you show up to this work is that it was a recommendation.
Right.
And yes, some of those recommendations will be accepted, but you have to be able to say, but this document is going to be what's going to ground us, right? It's going to ground us in moving forward these key performance indicators, and our job as a board is to monitor that. There was a lot of wordsmithing, by the way. So the copy that I got, that was like crossing out words and use this word instead, and that's not the job of the board. You guys got to get out of these weeds, right? Because how much time was spent on that? That could have been spent really thinking about how do we move this district forward. So I think it's just that's that piece too. I want you to consider. Yeah.
I think one of the problems that we have sometimes with coming to a conclusion is that the discussion goes on so long, and it goes on and on and on, and then we come back and we have the same discussion again, and it goes on and on and on. Meantime, things are due. The superintendent's evaluation was late, and we were still adding more days for discussion. And it isn't that the discussion, everyone's points were very important, nothing about the content, but it just kept going, and in the end, things are due. You can't just go on and on and on, and that sometimes we're not as strong as we should be in coming up with a protocol, perhaps, that would allow us to give everyone a chance to have their say, but that they would be thoughtful in crafting it so that they're not talking for 15 minutes here, and then they come back and there's another 20 minutes, and it kind of goes on.
Again,
everything they say
process.
is good and valuable, but there has to be an
process.
end to the process.
Yeah. No.
So I would appreciate it when we are developing the norms, if we develop something around that, because I do hear from everybody the need to make sure that we have collaborative discussion, and I do benefit from hearing the perspectives of everyone. And I do try to listen to say, okay, well, what exactly are they trying to get through to share with everyone, and how does that benefit children? I really do try to have that with an open mind. But then what then steers me in a direction of maybe not listening is when the discussion just drags on and on and on. And so I want us to be able to have a process in place where we, like you just elaborated, here's the topic, this is the discussion, this is when you need to submit your feedback, this is how we're going to receive the feedback, and we're going to come back on this, and then we're going to take a vote, and then it's done.
This is how much time we're going to give
And
to
this
that.
is how much time we're
That's
going to
what I
give
was
to
gonna
it.
add,
Because
how
it
much
does
time.
get frustrating when it seems like we're just going on and
Filibustering.
on and on.
That is-
Yes.
that's what
It's
I can-
filibustering.
And then we feel like we aren't moving in the same direction in order to get to that common goal. And then you have to steer, so just take the vote, because we got to steer, we got to go in some direction. And I just don't want us to be that way, because that's not healthy.
Yeah, because decisions are then made in frustration. Then
Right.
it's just like, oh,
Right,
okay,
not-
fine. Like,
yeah.
if we have to get to the point where it's like, fine,
Right.
just do it, then that's still not going to be what's
Right.
best for kids.
Right.
All right, let's keep. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I still tend to, if you went back to your fork in the road sign, You know, sometimes there could be a sign that says to the left is dead end and to the right is your favorite restaurant. And so I think as part of the process is that oftentimes that information sign may not be available or may not be available to each and every person that's driving that road so that we can make the correct choice. Also think that for me, like just going back to the example of the feedback, I really took it as I wanted to provide feedback for the board to consider my thoughts so then the board could provide thoughts to the administration. I don't really want to be in a position where it's like when we have a work session or a presentation, if the time set aside is an hour and then 30, 45 minutes is presentation, 15 minutes is Q&A, and then that constitutes board discussion leading to direction. I would like to see more opportunity given to the board collaborative discussion so that when we do provide input, it's still relatively coming from the board as a whole to the extent that we can, not 7 individuals providing feedback to the superintendent or administration to then try to figure out, you know, keep scratch.
And a good way to look at that is just going back and reviewing your meetings and determining how much time do we generally spend in a presentation and how much time do we spend. I know when I presented, when I was working and we presented, we had 15 minutes. And you got your 15 minutes, but the board usually had 45 minutes to an hour to discuss. But your presentation was in 15 minutes, and at 15 minutes, they kind of shut you down. Thank you very much, and we'll go to board discussion. So that, again, that's kind of, that's procedural.
10 to 15 minutes.
Right, but the board discussion piece hasn't really changed.
But then we look at beyond 45 minutes. I mean, we know there may be some more hot topics, but every issue cannot be an hour, 2 hours on it. And this is where it goes back to the work that has to happen, not just in the conversation that has to happen, not just in this room. You know, many could have said that Mr. Jordan could have taken his email that he had in his suggestions and shared it with each board member and had a conversation to make his point and to answer questions. You know, so there's a myriad of different ways that could have been done, and not just send it back and assume that everybody's going to say, hey, I wanted you all to see my recommendations, and that because I sent it out here, I expect that you will agree with some things or not. But honestly, the thing about it is that some of the things we did, some individuals like, you know what, I do agree with that. It's down there. So it's out there, but the follow-up and the conversation and just reinforcing and respected, it's not just what happens in this room, but it's the work outside after the meeting and also the preparation that's got to go in and preparing for the next meeting and the homework sometimes. It can't be the first time we're talking about it when we get in this room. That's how we have these long discussions sometimes, and we can't have 1 or 2 or 3 different board members monopolizing the entire discussion. I'll be perfectly honest. There are many times that I don't speak about stuff when I was just sitting as a regular board member just because of time. Or I've done my homework, or I don't feel like I need to add anything to the discussion because it's been so exhaustive.
So what I understand from that too is really thinking about what needs to go on the agenda, what's our work?
Yep.
What's the work that needs to be done, and are we committing to the work? Because using the example that Valda shared early on, is that where you want to spend your time, and how does that benefit each student in Norfolk Public Schools?
And a lot of times, we're going on and on about a topic that belongs to the superintendent. We're talking about things that we don't need to get down into the nitty-gritty of every single biography of a teacher that's applied. You know, the only ones that we should be talking about is the superintendent, because that's who we
That's
hire.
your one charge.
Right,
Yeah.
and we get into a lot of deep, lengthy discussions when we get those HR reports where they ask all these different little questions, which I'm sure is good information, but is it the information that we as the board member need, or is it what the superintendent needs? And so I think if we could choose, when we're doing an agenda, what it is that relates to what we're supposed to be doing at our level, not the operation.
And we're going to clarify that too. I think this discussion is
that'll help
helpful.
us.
I think the other thing that I want you to think about too, when you're providing feedback, is the yes and versus a no, like a no, right? So I think it could have been, and since you said, crossing out the superintendent letter, but maybe then saying, here's a suggestion for a unified letter from all board members and the superintendent. You see how that's received really differently than you get no voice versus here's what I'd love for us to have in there where all of our voices is in a letter. Can we put on the agenda a time for us to write a letter from the Norfolk board and superintendent for that front cover? That would be beautiful. I mean, and that's feedback that can be received far differently than just unilaterally crossing out the letter from the superintendent. And like I said, there's not a single strategic plan out there that does not have a messaging from its leader. So I think that you have to think about that, like how, asking oneself, again, that's self-regulating, how might this feedback be received? What is a way that I can be more collaborative? What can I provide in exchange for what I'm saying should go? Those are all things that you have to think about doing. All right, and I don't want to open a can of worms, and I want to just give that as an example, but this is a big part of our work, is thinking about, like, really seeing, I think Sharon does recognize, Dr. Birdsong does recognize the importance of the board for providing her with leadership and guidance, but you all have to similarly reciprocate that same level of autonomy and confidence in her expertise as the leader of this district. I think that's the main messaging. Yeah. Do we need to have a break? Because I know we've gone an hour.
Probably so.
Do you want to do a 10 minute?
Stand up.
Can we get like a 5 maybe?
Five?
Just
Okay,
come
let's do 5.
Okay.
All right. Highly effective for trustees and superintendents who have a governance mindset to govern effective board as coherent. We're going to talk about that term, coherent, who govern with the unity of purpose. Right? And then leadership from the middle, right? Thinking about those systems responsibilities. So we're going to an activity where, my laptop is we're in an activity where you'll see that each of you is going to assign one of those themes of good governance. Okay? So some of you are paired, some of you are solo.
Get a partner.
What I want you to do is, it's like a paragraph. So your page assignment is there, who you are and who your partner is assigned to you. So you can get up and walk around. So we've been sitting in that.
Don't worry about
Great.
myself.
Find your pair. Carlos is by herself and Sharon is by herself.
Boo.
Sorry, no fear for y'all. But I want you
You will learn to behave
find
so you can
your
get partners.
partner together, go to that page you're assigned, read
Yeah.
that paragraph together, bring a piece of paper with you. And what I want you to do is chart the key ideas from your short section, put them on sticky notes. And I want you to identify what could or would this look like for this board, and what is required for us to enact upon this mindset. Okay? You guys go to your corners, right? Read it together, and then answer those 2 questions, and then put them on sticky notes. We're gonna chart it. We're gonna have a discussion about it. Okay. So I'm gonna give you about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Sorry.
tablets.
So find your partner. Pick a nice place to go. You want to go in the hall? It's up to you. But take your page number, read it, discuss it, and answer those 2 questions.
This was my least favorite one in this section about, I mean, not least favorite, but didn't make a lot, it made sense, but not a lot of.
Oh, and then I want you all, I'm sorry, I forgot one part of my directions. You'll see the last one, it says striving for common ground, page 22. All of, each group does that one.
Oh,
Okay, so everyone does their assigned areas. We're gonna kind of do like a jigsaw, but everybody should read page 22.
divvy up my time.
Strive for common
15
ground.
minutes.
Okay?
We're identifying
15 minutes.
Okay.
You said the paragraph or the entire section?
That section, yeah. They're short, yeah.
And you have about 15 minutes for this.
Okay? All right.
All right, so our question,
So just the whole page, page 18.
18 all the way through.
all right, so we are highly effective
I guess it's just, it's
highly effective superintendent who have a governance mindset to govern efficiency. I think our question speaks to
Like our
small group needs to be.
Don't you?
Oh, okay, all right.
Mindset, we should be looking at the questions under the idea
That way, it's, it fits here in your
Do the share out and
what the role is,
And
in
actually,
my opinion. What do you
actually
think?
on page 31, it really lays it out, what because we're saying page 20.
Thank you so much. Well, she said looking at 22, but you said.
Many years, vision was seen to be
But I'm
the way
saying on page
forward.
31, it really lays
Over
it out.
time, vision has lost its cliche.
This is what really lays it out.
Time
I mean,
and
what
again,
it
we see
means.
another vision statement and set
Even though
of
we're looking at
goals
page
about
20,
putting
the single
children
most
first.
powerful governance
As it
force
turns out,
is governance
vision
mindset
statements
displayed by the most
express
successful
the
government
intent
board.
without being
But I'm
grounded
saying
in intensity of
31
action
really
or
lays it
track
out.
records.
Even though that's not
Every
the page
district
she
has a
gave
vision
us.
statement
Well,
on
it
paper.
doesn't necessarily
Few of them get realized in practice.
tell us
Contrast, the governance core
Are
model
we
is
looking
based on
through
the
it
depth
through
of
the
the moral
lens of
imperative.
what the
The
role
moral
of each
imperative
one
is
is?
about all children learning.
We're looking at how
Strategies to ensure
effective
that learning
trustees and
occurs.
superintendents who have a
All
governance
rapport between
mindset to
trustees
govern
and
effectively.
superintendent.
And the governing
It consists of
effective
strong
what is
relationships
required
between
of us
board
to
and staff.
enact?
What your role is.
Source out what is worth in fact-specific
So
terms.
what would this look like?
Here's indicators of progress. It combines excellence and excellence at its heart.
We're getting into
Governance
a
core is a
discussion.
force for raising the bar and closing the gap of learning for all students in the district,
Why would the
not
board
just an
involve in that?
aspiration, but as a reality.
In other words,
In short, the moral imperative embodies an emotional and empirical
effectively,
commitment
if we're wasting
that
all
all
our
children
time,
can and will
isn't
learn.
our level to be on.
Trustees, superintendents, staff, faculty, and
Regarding
parents
like
all
our
operate with the same broad understanding
Committees?
of the moral imperative. The district can accomplish
to
amazing
build-
learning
So
yet.
the
We have to
question
say-
is, what would this look
Active
like
and
as
coherent.
Instructive monitoring and
Are we
corresponding
supposed to
Board.
talk
exercise
about
of full
it?
confidence.
Help with the board or
We
what
are
should
The moral
a
imperative is
committee of
lacking.
one.
Let's ask.
What could or would
So
this
we're
look
looking
like?
at questions.
What is could or would?
It's could or would, and it could be should.
Here,
Yeah,
Whole
what,
purpose is geared
what
to
could it
real
look
concrete
like?
educational
With
goals
you
for
all.
children.
Should it look like?
Uh-huh. What could or would
Not
or
what
should.
it currently looks like.
Yeah, no, not what it currently looks like. We know what it currently looks like.
Yeah, yeah,
What
unfortunately
could or would or should it look like with this board?
Okay, so I think that's what we want to say.
Okay.
Right.
but I think one of the
Oh, and it is good.
there was a purpose for having a policy committee.
Well, one, I wholeheartedly endorse this whole
We were transferring
This is really what it should be.
And this is really,
the system that
We're looking at 20 though, which
she
is
gave
the
us
governance
22,
mindset.
this one. The
allow
governance.
an achievement gap.
We're looking at that, we're not looking at 22 yet. That's the one we all have to do.
committee.
Yes.
Oh,
That
thank
is
you.
one of our
Actually, we gotta do
purposes.
after we look at this one.
I like the
Focus, try to
discussion.
focus
The
on
four
this.
components
You
of
know,
governance
I
mindset.
see a lot of head
Systems
nodding
thinking,
and
strategic focus, deep learning, and manner.
clarification.
Manner, that's a good problem. Okay.
But on page 20 though, go to page 20 now.
Which, they do talk about here is that,
It starts on page 20 though, but
they're not an
the
initiative.
other ones,
Whereas
governance mindset is a system. But it
Or
could
in a cohesive manner with a unity
That's
of
the other
purpose.
reason for saying that.
Focus
That's a really strong, I should have put a star next to that when I was on.
areas of measurable outcomes.
It's a system phenomenon. They're saying governance mindset is a system phenomenon. The single most powerful governance force is the guidance mindset, governance mindset displayed by the most successful high-performing board trustees and superintendents.
Input
Governance
into the
mindset requires a fundamental understanding of all elements of
Yeah.
the organization.
Governance is about systems, not pieces.
Right.
So
So
we're
let's
looking
write
at
those on our things
highly
in.
effective trustees and superintendents who have a governance mindset.
And what does that look like? And like the one thing that you just read, which is what I like,
Practice?
I'm writing this one. It says, what you just read, governance
That makes it
is about
This would
systems,
also enable greater unity.
not pieces. Does that make, I think that's a good one to write down. for
Governance
that.
mindset, 135.
Feasibility is one.
Ed.
If we, so the,
Are we clear
Right.
on what they are?
Yeah.
Do we understand?
Liberating those below.
right, that is why we are here. So if we have to agree on
us keep our focus on the strategic direction versus.
So then we have to agree on how we, once we agree on that, now how are we then establishing goals and values so that we can
Like,
process.
Right. And there's
Discussion meetings.
I've governance, so your, like, all your meetings are
how
kind
are
of
we going to
policies.
follow along?
And the second one,
Any kind of
Board is operating in a unified, cohesive manner.
direction that we're going in.
That
Purpose.
will help create that unity of purpose is the strategic plan, but aligning the strategic plan. Sessions, by also, we're monitoring our policies at the same time.
What would it look like
How do you not
with the
give somebody a
superintendent
fire
and
hose
the board
that they don't go
working
down
together to
a
govern?
path?
So it's just
That's
like
what our
how we
question is
do
asking.
like
It's a
right?
policy-focused
this
governance.
item on the agenda satisfies
That
this
seems like
strategy.
About it. Like, if I really want this whole paragraph because it's important.
This is what you're reading, right? Governance mindset requires a fundamental understanding of all elements of organization, every single thing that's going on.
that we have to have a
The
fundamental.
persistence, because when you read this, it talks about how you're looking at everything together, not separately.
And not pieces, right.
Non-conform.
Not just
Our
pieces.
unity of purpose.
Not just building, not just bus transportation.
Actually, one of those.
Because there was one reference in here where they talked about being in the airplane, the helicopter, the airplane during the fire, and what it looks like there, and you can see all the things that go into November. You were on the line.
It distracted me from
On the ground.
It is no conversation.
That's right. And you're only seeing, and you're only seeing one piece, because you're trying to go front of the building.
Oh, you see, it's
Because what's going on in the back? Is it burning in the back? Is it burning in the side?
the whole thing. That was a great example that was right here in the book. And I think that's what it means,
It seems that
because we're all,
there
we're
is
all
a topic
look at it,
that's also
where
moved
should we
off
be?
the agenda. It's
We
one of
should
our
be
most important ones.
up here.
You should be in the plane, that's right.
So we can see everything, how it's going. We don't go down and take the hose. But how are we responding to the question? So what,
Or run in the front door. We don't need to be running in the front door.
no,
We don't.
This is what, I know, I mean, I've had the
not
same.
me. I'm not going in the front door.
Or breaking through a window. I mean, we shouldn't be doing
No,
that. Does that make sense?
even the
I think it's
superintendent should.
using
But it should be the superintendent that's guiding us. We're not doing that, we're just. So if we look at our
It
question,
is the job of,
what would this look like with the board? It means
they
that the
rely too much on the
superintendent
committee members
and
to
board
say, okay, we're bringing this for
are
your,
governing
we're recommending
effectively.
approval on this.
Boy, that's what we need to answer. But how, what does it look like to make that statement that we have next to our names accurate? That's what you're writing, you describe individual
But also the
right?
community, okay,
And we're not,
what is our
we're not just giving a
model of
setting
number
a
one?
we supposed to take out things?
Protocols in place that are enforced. Enforced. Those are, and a process
The
for
moral purpose is to
developing
and
this.
it's not so much philosophy, it's commitment. These three things. The things that my campaign ran on. Student achievement, quality teachers, and safe and secure environments.
Any of one.
That's what the whole thing's about. That's the level we should be looking at together with the superintendent, right?
What are the specs?
Oh, yes.
Action.
Well, not the, because to me, I see this as a piece.
Well, right, but this is as the philosophical belief is all these things that happen. In other words, you don't take them by the piece. You take these three things together. To me, and I look at this, and this is what I think should be happening in the school district. These are the three most important things. Everything else falls from them. This is what my campaign
You mean
said,
specs
these
or
three things.
expectations? I'm thinking specs like,
Because on the airplane,
like your engineering
think
thing,
they should
like I'm gonna be
have
this
quality
big,
I think there
this
should be quality,
performance, have these standards.
I think there should be quality bus drivers.
Go design it.
On the plane.
Oh, you're saying it's limited by the,
On the plane, I'm gonna see more than just.
Look like with this board.
But I'm
Oh,
on the
yeah.
plane looking down.
But if you look at all of it, you're gonna see all of these together, working together. And that's what it is, you don't look at the individual ones. You look at the final product, which is student achievement, in my opinion. All the other things is just noise. Student achievement is really the whole focus is. But how do we put that into
Of course. I'm talking about
what we're saying?
So I'm looking at what it looks like. Governance is about systems, not pieces. I think that's a big piece. That we
I
wanna
think
put
this
out
is
there.
very big.
How about fundamental understanding of all elements of the organization? I think that's critical.
Everyone should have that.
Right.
And then we know what we're
That's
supposed to
what
be
it should look
stepping our toe in and what we
Right,
should be letting
right,
the superintendent get there.
Right. And I like this one too. Governance is strategic.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a big one. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, those are the three, Lauren, I think,
Are we supposed to only do three?
I was gonna only get, let's just only get three.
Only give three.
Because I think this could encompass anything we're talking about. But you're talking about quality teachers, I think that would fall under governance is strategic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the teachers, principal, I mean, anything. In any staffing that we have, governance is strategic. Drivers, I mean, anything, governance is strategic.
I just feel like there's something,
And what is required for us to act upon this mindset
Process of
for
monitoring?
efficiency?
that we stay on the right side of the road. Who we're supposed to find quotes for.
Okay, let's look at page 31.
We're given page 20.
Yeah, but are we putting these up?
Look.
Got it.
Look, this is how we enact the mindset for efficiency. Look at page 31. Go to 31.
Old Star Trek.
Old Star Trek.
That's here.
Star Trek.
Episode of Star Trek. Of course, I want to keep this is for the second question.
Always focus on the
Question is, what is
children.
required for us to enact upon the
Oh,
mindset
so
for
you got,
efficiency?
oh, you got to focus on the
Well,
children.
let's choose three of them.
Yeah, okay.
Focus on two of them, of course, I think it'll be a good set.
Long-term goals.
We need a men in black one.
So long-term what?
Goals
Use that one. And what?
of the organization.
Stickies.
I think
And
that,
what's-
yeah, accountability. That's what, those, those were, I think they're all good. But focus on the children, focus on long-term
So
goals.
the organization.
Accountability.
That's what that too.
I think,
That's for
to
the
me,
second.
those would be
That's
good.
the second one. That's the second question.
Yeah, those, yeah, I agree. I agree.
So this is for the first question about what it looks like.
Systems, yes.
So this is
Are you
one,
trying to have us,
two,
Fundamental understanding of the elements of the organization.
and three.
And strategic. Okay, I'm fine with that. That's a go.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, I think so.
And this is what is required for us to enact upon this mindset.
Is that we have,
Focus on,
this
focus
is,
on
so I
children.
would give it an entrance. Board members have, or something like that, a colon, these three things.
Have a focus on children.
Focus on children. So a focus, and then you put on children, long-term goals of the organization, and accountability. So you have a feeder beginning.
Now, how do are we writing this? Writing this on something? All of it? How do you?
He said all of it.
Two teachers ain't following the instructions.
The most advanced group over there.
So small. I mean,
I know, that's why I use several.
I know, I had to use several
Well,
too.
we could do one, so give me, I'll do, don't we have any other colors?
There.
I have pink. So the pink
Well, I
is,
don't have any color.
you have blue.
I got it.
So
All right, so,
which
all right,
one do you want to do?
I'll do
I'll
the
take color one.
focus one, let me
Okay,
have that.
now how about page 22 though? Let me see what, I forgot about, let me look at that. While you're writing yours, go on, I'm gonna write mine, because our time is running out. Page 22,
So we're gonna do one on each sheet?
yeah, of your three.
we'll explain it, okay? All right. We're ready.
Oh, we're not ready.
We're ready, yep.
This is- this one.
I know, yeah, that's, yeah. For common ground, yeah, for common ground.
I'm supposed to write a separate one on each block. But I'm writing number 2 at the top.
Really?
I'm putting like question number 2 at the top, and then I'm putting what my, each piece on the page.
So you got all 3 of them? Let me get my pen. Ready.
That's this Thursday. Okay.
I thought if we make sure she knows that we mean which questions, that's why I'm putting question number 2 at the top of all 3. Okay, so they look like this. How's that?
Yes.
Are an individual, because as it says,
And then go to page 22.
to control our behaviors.
We need to write some of these down. Common ground. Could you write these? Let me see.
Well, that gives me a second question.
It's question number. It would be common ground, right? Common ground at the top.
Are we supposed to have a second, I said another question?
Common ground is the top, right? Common ground on the top. That's the top.
I spell ground.
G-R-O-U-N-D.
Blank. All right, and then I'm doing what?
What does it look like? What does common ground look like for the board, for our board? What does it look like? And these are all the things that they
So
say.
should we list all of them on one page?
I wouldn't list all of them. I would choose the 3 important ones.
There are only 3 here.
Look at them. No, it's more.
Okay.
Look at the most critical 3, and I'm gonna use your judgment on that. Let me see.
Oh, this is where they address the difficult board member. This is the difficult board member thing. This all has to do
But
with,
it's also striving for common ground.
Oh,
is
okay.
Reserve judgment. But I think that's a critical one. That's
I
one
think
of them.
reserve
Oh, we gotta
judgment.
do 3. Look at which 3 are the most important.
Education, what could this look
I think this one is important too, Laura. Right?
Spell with it. I'm just interested to see if,
Well, look at all of them.
yeah, they're no longer using ease and judgment at all anymore.
We need to do that. We need to do that, and I have
Okay, there. And then, listen, it's very important. Don't you think?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
underneath that.
Those are nice, you know, like I'm in. Oh, sorry.
2, 1.
I need one more common ground one. Focus on content. True to the norms. Do not make differences purposely.
I think that's a critical one right here.
Don't, the one, this is the one I raised in our discussion. Okay. I don't don't know if that's as important as be true to the norms.
I like this one better.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we said it. I think it kind of goes right
Wrap
to
up
what
your
you already
thinking and wrap up your conversation, but extend your thoughts, because what we're going to do now is just go back and reflect on each of those sections, key ideas, and really think about what would this look like, or what this look like, or even what should this look like with this board, with this team, and then in order to make that happen, what's required? What's required to really enact this mindset? So, three things: charting, which you've already done, written it down. So, I'm giving us a recap of what you've already done, and then providing us with what should this look like, or what could it look like with this board, and then also what is it going to take to make it happen. By sections that way. Yeah. So we'll
Okay, we'll get them in order.
First section, which was making a commitment to good governance. So that was Carlos.
Just ignore it.
Okay.
Thought you had the last one.
No, I got the one all on top. It's all good. I'm eating all this sugar, and then I can't see, but okay.
So just a couple of key notes, key ideas, and then what should it look like, or what could it look like, and what's going to be required.
So tell us about what you read first. Give us the highlights, and then answer those two questions and what you put on your stickies, and we're going to chart them.
What I put on that. Okay, so making a commitment to good governance. So actually, there's like a section in here that I think just kind of really captures it all in here. So this is as part of McAdams, who's one of the authors here, that talks about when he writes what school boards can do, reform governance for urban schools. And he quotes, only boards, because of the democratic power they derive from the people, because of their close links with the people, and because of their stability, can provide the leadership required to redesign and sustain over decades school districts that they provide equity and the results for all children. The most have chosen not to do so is not an argument for stripping them of their power. So even though they haven't done these things, it isn't an argument to just get rid of them and not keep the power. Rather, it's an argument for showing them how to exercise their power. And so when I read that, it really just kind of brought in the honing that, going back to some of the governance training that we had before about, that we represent our communities. We're that trusted voice. We were put here for a reason, in that even though things don't necessarily gel, doesn't mean that you throw them out with the bathwater. It's really, are you focusing and harnessing all of those, going back to those individual circles, to train them on how they can become better. And if you commit to that, you're going to get what we kind of talked about in this next piece, which is each board member and the superintendent committing to work together is essential, and that's both in their words and in their actions. And actions to become a more highly effective governance core team together, and that's
So is this what could or would it look like?
That's, yeah. If we did this, this is what we could do. So in other words, that topic, that paragraph I talked about before, that it may look like there's chaos, but you can kind of, it's almost like in the respect that there's some good gumbo. Gumbo's a little bit of something or everything, but you can kind of pull it together if you do the right thing. And so the other piece of that was, I kind of put that stripping down.
What's required to get there?
Yep. So what's required to get there is commitment, individual commitment, clear direction on what that looks like, and understanding that it's not perfect, that everybody's not going to be perfect. But if you generally want to do good and you commit to that, and I think that there might be some other things that people talk about that one, but if you kind of set with those expectations and with those those norms of hey, it's that, what's the rules of engagement? And if we all agree with those rules of engagement are, it can eliminate some of the confusion and some of the breakdowns that could potentially happen, and always keeping you back there. So it's almost like that bumper thing. Just because you're playing, you may be bowling. You know, you got the little bumpers. You know, it doesn't mean that if you have the bumpers aren't there and you don't hit a good strike, you get a gutter ball. But if the bumpers are there, it can kind of you can still meet the mark. But you've got something that kind of keeps everybody together. So that's kind of my analogy.
Yeah, and going back and practicing that, using the
Exactly.
bowling analogy.
Practice
So
makes
it's
perfect.
constantly practicing and reminding, okay, let's go back and talk about what our norms are before we get started.
Yep.
Let's make sure we're grounded in those.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah.
Post those for us. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
So the next one was a shared moral imperative that drives the work of the board and superintendent and the strategic direction of the district.
That's Rodney and Noel.
Well, we both agreed that this is something that all board members feel a deep sense and purpose and commitment to, but that we have a hard time demonstrating that in action. And in order, what would it look like if we could do this? We said it would look like a lot of dedicated time up front as a governance team to set the specs, the expectations, and that we're very clear on our measurable outcomes with understanding the process of monitoring, which then leads to execution. And in order for that to happen,
Is this, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll just add to that we, just in terms of our process, we read it out loud to each other and then kind of talked through it. And then also gave some focus to, I think we talked about measurable outcomes and indicators, and had a good discussion around the three fundamental actions and the three examples that they gave. And maybe part of what it could look like for us is getting to the point where we had three fundamental actions that just kind of guided other things. But then we also had a science fiction conversation around, I guess I initially was talking about a Star Trek episode where they had this robot, and he would, if he shined his laser on you, you would forget everything. And then Dr. Gabriel said that also happened in Men in Black. And so we were saying we need to find a way of having an experience like that and then reprogramming ourselves around this intentional commitment to student achievement, and just kind of rebuilding our whole mindset, if you will, after we have erased everything that we know we carry.
So that moral imperative leads you to action.
Yeah.
And that action helps you build activism really with your community, so that the community understands that it's not just the board that's responsible as well, but we share this responsibility with the community, with the parent community, with our entire community. So yeah, thank you for that. And the analogy of Star Trek and Men in Black, I love it. Yeah, I think we all could use sometimes, to forget about that, but it's not just forgetting the action. Sometimes it means forgetting that feeling and understanding that that growth and discomfort that might come with that helps you to grow.
And
that discomfort rather helps you to grow.
Throughout our passage, it almost every paragraph focused on all children can learn, what the children it was all about student outcomes. It was all about students. And so we talked about how do we make that our central focus, and then maybe that'll help some of the other stuff not be a constant point of distraction. Right?
Being a student-centered board, yeah. And maybe that is your shared moral imperative, right? Maybe that's the language you want to adopt, that as a student-centered board, we fill in the blanks, right? Okay, put your stickies up for us.
Thank you. All right, next is highly effective trustees and superintendents who have a governance mindset to govern effectively, and that's Lauren and Leon.
Yes, and we'll start by reading a little inset here. The single most powerful governance force is the governance mindset displayed by the most successful, high-performing board trustees and superintendents. So mindset is very critical in us doing our work. as a board, and there were 3 things that came out as relates to what would or could this look like with this board. And the number 1 piece that we put out is governance is about systems, not pieces. So being systematic is very important about the work that we do. Being very systematic, that is very critical in the work that we do. And then another piece that came out is a fundamental understanding of all elements of the organization. And I call that having an overall understanding of this organization. That is critical for us to do the work. We have to have an overall understanding of the organization, you know, what it looks like. And I think my colleague had a really good example. Could you tell about it with the airplane thing that you were talking about?
Oh, no, right, and I'm sure we all read about the airplane is flying over the forest fire as the country's burning up, and the board member, or whatever they're calling them on this one, the trustees, from there can look across and see the fire's coming in this way, and they're managing to get it controlled here, but it's not happening here, and they need to do this here and that. Or they might land to help personally and grab a hose and hose it, but which one is the appropriate action for a trustee? So.
I love that.
That we need to have that overall understanding. We should not be down there trying to break windows out, knocking doors down as the board, as a board member. But we should see the big picture in terms of giving guidance, or maybe even, you know, setting policy things that we should, you know, maybe think about in terms of a fire or whatever, but not going down there and getting in that fire.
Right, it all has to do with.
Doing the flyovers.
That's right, that's right.
Everything that's happening,
That way
and then
we can be
report back and
radioing
say, this
in,
is what's happening.
You know, go to this
Right.
place, or do this, or get more water in or something, rather than just shooting your hose on one little flame.
And what I love about that analogy, too, when you think about it too, from a strategy perspective, if as a board, the strategy, right, the set of intentional actions that we put in place is that we will assess where the smoke is, right? Like we're gonna find the source of those fires, versus we all run, scatter, I have a hose, I have a bucket, I'm gonna go kick the hose. And then come back and say, well, I saved more people.
Right. That's
I
right.
was in Ward so-and-so, and I knocked down
That's
20
right.
doors, and you know what I'm saying? Because then it's now it's coming back and saying, here's how I was effective and you were not. Because it was about having an intentional strategy. We will all get in this helicopter. We will all assess where the resources are most needed. Our work as a board is to determine who needs most water, who needs most, what you know what I mean, right? Yeah, so.
And it was kind of like what Mr. Jordan said when he was saying about the 2x2s and 1x2s, that he was uncomfortable with that because he was looking for all 7.
Yeah, big picture.
So, same kind of.
Yeah, this is perfect because we're actually going to talk about systems thinking and about like coherence with
This
the
is
bigger
all about
picture.
systems.
So, absolutely.
And this ties right into the 3rd piece that we talked about, that governance is strategic, that being strategic is a big part of what we do also as a board, which ties what you said, what we were saying, that being strategic in our decisions and our discussions and, you know, some of the things that we talk about, some of the policy we pass, that it has to be strategic.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then the next,
Strategic and, again, driven by your moral imperative.
Yes,
notice how we're just bringing them all together here.
what is
Right.
required.
And so we go to the question 2 with what's required, and we looked at a number of the things on the list and the different lists, and we were told to do 3, and we felt the most important were, number 1, focus on the children. That's it. That's saying it all right there. But then we added the 2 things that we think really contribute to that, and that's that we focus on the long-term goals. Where do we want to get at the end of the road? And then we focus on our own personal accountability.
Accountability
So,
was important.
children, long-term goals, accountability are what we feel should be the focus to move us forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, perfect. Post those for us, please. Excellent. Next
Thank you.
is,
Next is the effective school boards as coherence makers who govern with a unity of purpose.
that's Tanya and Adele.
So first, first is defining the unity of purpose. What is our unity of purpose? And I think that, again, collaborative discussion and coming up and having that agreement on what is our unity of purpose. And I think, speaking to recent examples, I think we've all can agree that we are here to serve our students and to ensure positive student outcomes. So with that unity of purpose, how do we get there as coherence makers? And so, you know, one of the one paragraph I think that resonated with us for this purpose of this discussion is that governance is a policy. The paragraph that talks about that governance is a policy, strategic based. Hold on, let me put my glasses on. Strategic based function. That's what governance is. This is a crucial point because of the potential role confusion for board members if they do not understand this fundamental difference between this fundamental difference. Governance is a well-defined organizational function that requires specific skills different from administration and curriculum instruction. Board members are elected to govern, not manage or teach, and to complicate matters even more, boards govern, not individual trustees. And so with that, we also felt that with the overarching purpose of being student outcomes focused, that this would be executed through policy, okay, and being policy focused. And that is as one of our core, you know, functions is to govern through policy. So how would we achieve that mindset? We've talked about, you know, where we are currently, this board specifically, and being a committee of one versus having board committees right now, and maybe bringing, and we've talked about this over probably the last year, or maybe longer, about right now we have current board committees, which includes our policy committee probably being the most, you know, again, reflective of one of our core function, and that having the policy committee be removed and that we as a governing body oversee policy. And one of the reasons for that is, you know, this paragraph talks about confusion among board members. I think what that would allow us to do is that it forces us to be really engaged with understanding what our policies say, whether they're enforced, whether we're upholding them to the best of our ability. And that is also guiding our efforts as it relates to, you know, any policy changes through our governments, and I think it reinforces our roles and responsibilities. I think it also ensures that each board member is aware of what we say as a district that we're going to do. And right now, that because we have 2-member committees, you know, those 2 members are very in tune with our policies. And not to say that the full board is not, but I think that there may be an over-reliance on the 2 members to say, okay, they're recommending these policies, so check. You know, it's kind of like we're hitting the checkbox versus really being engaged in that work and letting that drive the work of the board. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
That's why she wrote and spoke.
Hopefully, because it makes sense.
Look at all these words.
And the other thing about that, as it relates to the unity of purpose, is that right now we have committees where there's 2 members on committees, and we don't necessarily. When 2 members have information that the full board does not have, yeah, it's asymmetry of information. And as we work to build that trust, it's important that we all have the information at the same time. And I think it allows for greater collaboration. And so that's the other reason of getting to that mindset, of a governance mindset. So that's those are some of the things we talked about.
That makes sense. And I'm wondering too, as I was listening to you speak, I was just thinking about, like, I work with Charlotte Mecklenburg's board, and their small group committees are around things, not necessarily policy, right? So maybe one of the things you can consider as we further discuss this is what are the things that we want to have be small group committees, and what are the things that we want to have as not be small group committee, but also when you do have committees, what's the share out process? So that, again, going back to the word process, right? So that people are always clear on what each committee's responsibilities are. Having a charge and expectations document for each committee, that's your template for how you're reporting that back out. So I think those are some things that would address what you're speaking to. But what I also agree is that when a board is as fragmented as you are, some things you have to think about, maybe not being committees, but being full board discussion. Because if the trust was there, if the things we were talking about were there, it would be less of an issue, right? And so I think that that's something for you to consider as we continue to do these ideas that are elevated. You know, some of them we're going to need to explore and say, you know, this came up, this is something that we want to do. But I do think around policy, because the main work of a board is policy discussions, it should not rest with just one person. So we can continue to discuss that, but that's a good point to elevate.
We'll have to comment.
You can. I'm giving you permission to comment.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to, I appreciate what they said. I would offer that in addition to that we might look to differentiate our policies that are strategic and student focused from our policies that are operational in focus, because it's hundreds of them. But it's very easy, if we're going to not be in the management business, to confuse the operational policies from the more overarching
And having a
strategic
policy
policies.
review schedule, right, where, you know, as part of your calendar, you know which policies you're going to be reviewing, which regulations you're going to be reviewing, and then matching them to which behaviors are we seeing in terms of how this policy or this regulation is being enacted, right? Because sometimes this is behavior, it might be written on paper somewhere, but it's the practice, right? So policies, regulations, and then practices, actual practices, that may be something that you guys discuss as a full board. I appreciate that. Thank you. So put those up as well. Let's go to the next one, because we want to spend our last hour developing norms. So I really want to reserve our time. Who's that? Oh, Sharon's next.
Okay, thank you. To me, this was like the least exciting one of all of the components. I thought, when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh my gosh, but then I got assigned to it today, so I'll try to make it a little more exciting than what it really is. Just to kind of set things up in the definition, the text says local school districts, of course, operate in the context of system policies and responsibilities. In our work on system change, we and others and they name a colleague, they developed that whole concept of leading from the middle. They also suggest that you can't get system coherence from the top because it's just too complex. And we all know that. And then you can't really get it at the bottom because it's too piecemeal. And so as I was thinking and reading through this, some of the things that we could do or look for on this board is basically what they've set up in the text, which are pretty simple, but more probably challenging to actually operationalize. So we could, number one, work to interpret state policy. And that would mean that we would have to be more proactive than we are. We should be consumers of policies and ensure that whatever these state level policies, whatever policies that we're dealing with, we need to align them with our local work. And so, again, not having things done to us, but really being proactive and being a part of that process. And then the second thing would be working with other divisions and other agencies. So I think that's a good thing if we were to set aside some time. And I know for me as a superintendent, I often collaborate with my colleagues around the state and around the region especially. We depend a lot on each other. We have a very tight knit group. But I think a lot of us individually have our own separate groups that we work with. But I don't think collectively we ever come back to have major discussions around some of our work, and I think that would be definitely helpful. And then liberating those below, and that's a terminology that the text used. I thought, okay, now that's going to be interesting. And so that's just enabling other groups to work together. So we have to create that paradigm here and then make sure as we're working with our classroom teachers, our building administrators, that they too benefit from the policy work that we're doing. And so what would be required to enact this mindset? Basically, I believe that we have to have a strong belief that if we engage in this type of work, that it's going to make a difference because it will be time consuming. It will be apart from coming together twice a month. It will take some time and actually setting aside some time to have those deep level conversations. And we've said this word throughout the morning. We need a process. Like, what does this look like? Because it can be very complicated if you think about all of the moving pieces and parts. So that's what I'd like to
Excellent.
offer.
Thank you, thank you. Coach, your sticky notes also, the other thing to think about too, as you were saying, like liberating, what was the term they used again?
Liberating those below.
Yeah, that's really about giving, it's shared understanding of this work, but also providing for earned autonomies,
Yes.
right? So so as a board, you put in place policies and regulations, what implementation of that might look different from building to building, and you got to be okay with that, right? Because what you're monitoring is the development of policy that gets us to the end result. And so that liberating of others, so you don't have to always own all the work, is about earned autonomies. I remember seeing on executive staff in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, and we had been asking principals about, like, whether they were able to do something. I forget what it was, and they were like, "We're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to do that." I kept getting the answer. The answer to everything was like, "Well, we're not allowed to do that." Nowhere was it written that they weren't allowed to do that, right? But they just didn't know they had certain autonomies. And so I think a big part of it is also communicating to people here is where, and I notice I use the term earned autonomies, right? When a school is making progress and they're showing results in their data, they earn some autonomies. Where we have, some schools that are specifically struggling that we want to make sure we're monitoring closely and tightly, they may not have those earned autonomy. So that liberation piece is about how do we, as a board, decide what our parameters are for those earned autonomies, and how do we communicate that so people aren't walking around saying, "I'm not allowed to do that, I'm not allowed to do that," and it's not even there's no policy anywhere that says you're not allowed to do that, right? But that's the belief, that's the mindset. So that liberation piece speaks to that for me. Excellent. And then I asked you all to read Striving for Common Good. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, striving for the common ground.
Well,
Brown, that's a good.
so in working with Dr. Gabriel, at least my thought was, I'll make an I statement. I was looking at the Striving for Common Ground very similar to the recommendations that we made and what Dr. Bursong just said in terms of setting the time aside to do the upfront, sometimes nasty, gritty work to get to mutual understanding and agreement, which at least on the engineering world, you spend the time up front and it saves you money on the back end versus not spending the time up front and you spend all day fixing bugs or software fixing bugs. So I think that striving for common ground can go back to what Dr. Bursong just mentioned about having that commitment to that upfront time and perhaps being willing to let things that we don't have to do that aren't legally required be set aside for us to spend that time on the upfront stuff and spend that time on those 3 to 5 actions that we talked about, and letting some of that other stuff just go.
Any others on striving for common ground? Any thoughts?
We just came up with little terms for 3 that we thought were really important. I mean, for common ground, like that when you talk about common ground, it has to be intentional, particularly about reserving judgment. That has to be intentional. I mean, very intentional. And then another one my colleague says, listening empathetically, and that was kind of a common ground piece. And of course, to us as a teacher, for the teacher in me, that's kind of a skill set. Like listening is a skill set. I can teach listening. So we saw that more as a skill set. And then the third one we looked at, do not take difference personally. And that goes to my Q-tip. Quit taking it personally. Everybody needs a Q-tip. I tell all my students, oh yeah, I do. When I talk about emotional intelligence, I said, I'm giving everybody a Q-tip. Quit taking it personally. And I think that can be taught also really, but it also is a little bit more looking at things holistically also. When you go Q-tip, you're kind of looking at things more holistically anyway, and not kind of saying, ooh, they're picking on me. I think they're picking on me or whatever. So those were the 3 things that we got out of common ground.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for participating in that activity. I think it was really powerful, right? And so what we know is that the governance mindset is I'm summarizing it, right? Always keeping the focus on children. Also watching the budget, right? Because you do have fiscal responsibility for moving this work forward. Keeping focus on those long-term goals of the organization, right? So you're not in the weeds on that day-to-day. That's what you all talked about. Building and maintaining strong governance infrastructure, which we've all talked about over and over again, processes, right? Supporting the staff and creating a positive organizational culture. That goes back to the earned autonomies because they're part of this work. holding the organization accountable to the community it serves, right?
Accountability.
Just talked about that.
Yep.
And then keeping the constituents of the organization informed on the work of the organization, which again speaks to that whole idea of how you all craft the narrative, right? That the narrative of the work, and I'm not saying we're making it up, but if we're doing it in that way, you have the story to tell, and it's important that you tell the story. So that's important. Skipping that. So what we heard mentioned throughout some of this reading so far is the idea of systems thinking, which Peter Senge is kind of famous for. So let's just watch a quick clip of him explaining systems thinking, and I want you to react to it.
Well, the term systems thinking is really I use it very, very cautiously. First, both words are problematic. The word system is the most problematic, because if you say the word system, the picture or image that pops up into most people's head is computer system. Like, you know, we need a systems expert here because our system's not working. The second most common association is management control system, as it's not my fault, it's the stupid system, right? So these are the two associations that come first to people, and neither of them is what we're trying to help people understand. So whenever I'm trying to help people understand what this word system means, I usually start off by saying, are you part of a family? Everybody is a part of a family. Have you ever been seen in a family, people producing consequences in the family, how people act, how people feel, that aren't what anybody intends? Yep. How does that happen? Well, you know, then people can tell their stories and think about it, but that then grounds people in not the jargon, you know, system or systems thinking, but the reality that we live in webs of interdependence. A family is a fairly close-knit one. You can kind of see most all the key players. But still, even though we can identify maybe on a list of 10 or 15 names, here's all the key people in my immediate family, still the complexity of interactions amongst all those people is obviously such that consistently families produce outcomes that nobody wants, which is the other kind of, you might say, fundamental rationale for all of this. It's not to, quote, understand systems. That's an abstraction. It's to understand how it is that the problems that are the most vexing and difficult and intransigent that we all deal with come about. And obviously, to get a perspective on those problems that gives us some leverage and some insight as to what we might do differently.
What I like about this is because it makes so much sense, right? When we think about systems, we always say that that's just the way it is. It's above my pay grade. There are so many systems, right, lowercase systems that are part of the district. The work of the board is to be focused on the uppercase systems. Does that make sense? The big S systems, and I didn't use a cuss word because one time big S, people are like, did she just say, no, I didn't. Big S systems is what I want you to be focused on, recognizing that there are so many small lowercase systems that you can get caught up in, and I think that becomes a distraction. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So you think about it, if we say that the work of the board is to lift all children up, right? And so you say policy decisions that create opportunity gaps, both inside and outside of our public school systems, cause some schools to rise while others are weighed down. You as a board have to think about, well, what are some of the harmful policies that may be, creating inequities in our schools, right? And so when you think about this graphic, this is a good example of, we've got schools that are in wealthier areas and we've got schools that are in poorer areas. And if we make unilateral system-wide decisions, some of those may weigh down schools that already have things that are bringing them down, for example, right? And so you see like the weights in the graphic there, ongoing history of discrimination or policies that fail to educate, each or enrich each child. And so you want to be thinking about, when you have these policy conversations, you want to be thinking about what are the policies that are school-centric and what are the policies that are system-related, right? Your work is in the system reforms. I would say that Dr. Birdsong's work is in enacting upon the school-centric reforms. Does that make sense? Because I'm trying to help you delineate, what are we focusing our time on? Are we spending our time in the wrong things? I want you to think about, how do we set those higher level things that we know will not further weigh down already marginalized populations, or may not weigh down other schools that may have other factors that are already making it harder for them, right? And so you're always going to be focused on those bigger system reforms when you're policy making. And this is just a graphic with some examples of it.
So let's give people a chance to just read over those for a second to see, are there some that you might add? Are there some that you all have been focusing on as a board that really should be the focus of Dr. Birdsong?
And some you might look at and say, we have no control over that.
That's what I was just thinking. Some of the ones under the systems.
But here's the thing, right? While you may not have control over that particular thing, you do have control over putting policies in place that help address the impact of whatever that is. Does that make sense? That's your work.
And budget.
I think that one of the things we probably all agree on is the fair and affordable housing policies, that we don't have a lot of, but we do get criticized because our population is dwindling. But, you know, we can't control the construction that the planning commission, you know, what the city is putting up more, they're building less family-friendly homes. And so, and our cost of living is higher than some of the surrounding areas where a family can afford a home.
So, but what can you do, right? So if that's the status, if that's the way that it is, what do you do then to create, what's the word I'm looking for? One, understanding of that to the larger community, so they're not holding you accountable to it. But, and when you think about that narrative shifting, what do we do to still make those areas attractive to our families? So there may not be, or you know, housing may be more expensive here, but here's where, in this area, our schools are as great, right? If that's the messaging, right? That even in this zip code, zip codes don't differentiate the quality of the schools in Norfolk Public Schools, right? You see how you're countering that message? Right? And so you're not allowing that negative narrative to continue to flourish. You're saying, but, you know, and, right? And that becomes your messaging, and you set policy and budget, and you get behind that in the work of the board.
And who do you need to partner with to do that? Because it could be that there are some external partners that could also help share that message, share it differently. I know in the area that I live in, one of the things that always pops up is when people are buying houses, they always highlight, well, this is the school. This is the school for that area. If you're interested in purchasing here, here's the school that kids would be going to. And it got to the point where people focus more on the school than they did on the community and on the house and the development. And so changing, as Valda said, we have to change those narratives, or we have to counter those narratives so that people understand that this is a great system for each child. It's not just a great system for the kids who live here. It's a great system for each child in this community, and here's why.
And you get with the real estate agents on that, like just use your example, right? The realtors, you get, you know, websites like Zillow and those places that are grading your school, you control, you get to say, here's what that should say about, here's, you know, like, here's the thing, here's the blurb about that school in that neighborhood. You take that control back, so that's a good example. There were a couple of hands up, so I know I saw Ms. Bassane too, so I don't know. Go ahead.
So I guess I'm having a little trouble with this chart is, now, if the school-centric reforms had a specific name of a school on there, you know, and those were the things, I think I could see that delineation a little more clearly, but for me, some of those items underneath, you know, and I'm going to use culturally responsive instruction, for instance, that is rooted in state policy, right? And so that is, and I believe so that it would become a systemic reform, right? That it is happening across the district. And that would be something that I see as the board being responsible for ensuring that
is implemented with fidelity.
Fidelity, right? That's one example, and again, I think a board's commitment to high-quality pre-K beyond what is required, I think, again, is a systemic reform. You know, if that's like, you know, having mixed income pre-K, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are examples, but to your point, though, I do like what you're saying, because I think you can say, what does this look like in this school? Like, so what does it look like in this particular environment, and then how do we scale it, right? So then what ends up happening is a school-centric reform idea concept may become a system one when you scale it. Does that make sense? But I think the other piece to that too is that you as board members are not, I'm sounding really loud, are not, you're not monitoring small class size from building to building.
No.
You're looking at the impact of smaller class size in the district, and has that lent itself to better student outcomes.
Right, and as a policy, we could say, you know, by the state or developed by us as a board, could
We
say
want.
this is what we want.
Yeah.
And then it would be up to the administration to then implement.
And report back out,
And report
and
back
you
out,
hold
right.
accountable to that. So here, I want to take you to this next example, because I think this is what I want you to think about. This is the systems iceberg. I don't know if you've seen this before. I use icebergs for everything. We have icebergs for, you know, all kinds of things. But one of the ones that, what I love about this is that the work of the board is to get beneath the surface, right? And sometimes boards spend more time talking about the event, that surface level, the situation, the event, the activity, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. What your work should be is in saying, well, where are there patterns across our district that we need to be paying attention to, right? You know, sometimes those patterns are clearer to see, sometimes they're not, but that's your work, is to find out where is this happening throughout our district. You go and collect the data, you go to your respective wards, you bring that back, and you say, here are the patterns that we need to address. And then what are the underlying structures, right? So where's their causation? It goes back to the example, actually, I was thinking about this when you were talking about the flyover. You could spend time saying, as board members, there's fires, there's some, there's a bunch of fires, right? That's the event. The coming up with the strategy, the saying, where are these, is there a pattern as to where they're occurring throughout the district, right? We can only find that out if we do the flyover and we see it from a larger aerial view. Okay, what's the underlying structures? In each of those areas where there's fires, there's, I don't know, more trees. I'm making stuff up now, right? There's more of a certain kind of tree that has higher burning potential. Now we're getting to the source of what we need to be working on. You come back to the table and you're saying we need to figure out how we move those trees, right? Or how we, you know, whatever the case is. And then you think about, what are those models that we need to be thinking? What are the mental models that we use to approach our problem solving, right? And so that goes to the thoughts and the deeply held assumptions that affect how we make sense of things.
And how we sometimes can place blame on things, like, oh, well, it's this way because they don't have enough water over here to put that fire out. Or they decided to plant all of those trees.
Or those kids are poor.
Yeah.
Those kids don't speak. Their parents are, you see what I'm saying? Like those things that become part of like the excuse making that we make. And then you see, when you really dig deeper, it's getting to, now what are our cultural and institutional values that play out in the decision that we made to solve this problem, the policy that we wrote, whatever the case is. What are the things that we don't realize that we're even embedding in the way that we approach problem solving that are part of just the way we do things here, right? And we say that they're part of our values. And so what I love about this is it forces you to think differently about your work and move beyond just being in the addressing of the event. We're just going to spray water on the fires. We're not going to do the work of seeing the source of the flames, seeing the commonality, like those patterns, right? And then saying, okay, so what are the structures? Your work as board members is identifying those structures, right, and addressing them, but also being very cognizant of what your models are, what your mental models for problem solving are, and how you play out the values that you say are part of the values of this district. So this iceberg is just a way for you to think about your work and moving past the event, because what ends up happening is people come to you with the event. Here's the event, this school needs this school needs that, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, and you spend time only addressing the event because you want to have people see, look, we addressed the event. You may ultimately address the event, but what we need you to do is to do the deeper understanding and increasing the leverage to get to addressing the event. Make sense? Okay. All right. So as you think about the board and the superintendent as a team, which quote best describes the team from your perspective and why? 'Cause we're going to move into thinking more about who does what.
You're saying as it exists now?
Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Go for the gusto. Activity doesn't mean productivity. Ready, fire, aim. Time waits for no one. Slow but sure. Look before you leap. Opportunity knocks but once. Seize the day. Carpe diem. When in Rome, do as the Romans. All things are possible once it is realized that everything is at stake. Success is not a doorway, it's a staircase. When you're on thin ice, you might as well dance.
Today, you're talking about today, or just,
Yeah.
you know, over the past.
In general, go ahead.
Mine
I know what
is,
stood out.
ready, fire, aim.
Yes, I agree. I agree with Mr. Jordan.
Yeah.
And I also thought that activity doesn't mean productivity. Because just because we talk about it.
Doesn't mean
and say
anything
it,
happens.
It doesn't
Yep.
mean that it's happening.
Those are the two that came from me too. Any others?
Look before you leave.
Yeah, I think that's a good one too.
Which one?
Look before you leap.
Yep.
And I would even say, like, where are we looking, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the reason why we're bringing this for you, because we want you to be thinking about, like, you know, what would be that one quote that describes the way you're approaching the work. And if you are saying it about yourselves, right, that, you know, that we may be doing things, right, tactics, but it's not getting us where we need to be. So that's the activity, doesn't necessarily mean productivity. Yeah.
I didn't say one. Can I?
Oh,
say
go ahead.
one? I think that during COVID, the nothing ventured, nothing was supposed to be nothing, not noting gained. I really liked that, you know, the way that our leadership navigated better than any other district in this area, and that it was very data focused. You know, it's easy for us to kind of forget how
Hard that was.
I mean, we had no guidebook, right?
Nope.
And so it became data, what's best for the children, and let's try this. Let's take this step forward. And there was a lot of anxiety every time, but we put the effort in to really understanding, okay, weighing our options here and what's best for the kids. And so nothing ventured, nothing gained. We ventured together through that.
Good. And I appreciate you bringing that forward, because I think you can be more than one thing at a time, right? You can struggle with, you know, ready, fire, aim, but then when it counted, when it came down to it, we took the venture and we saw some successes from it. So,
But I also think it's an opportunity to think about, now, what was it about that, other than the fact that we were all, as globally, really, we were dealing with something so catastrophic, but what can we learn from that we can now bring back to build the kind of relationships and collaborative effort and collaborative work that came about as a result?
because it could have been, when you think about it, it could have been like, you know, we may not be a cohesive team all the time, but as the nation was going through this big collective trauma, we got it together. That could be the message,
right? Like when that is the pinnacle thing,
we pulled it together.
We have to safely get these kids back in school or in education, then we come together on that.
I often think about how when COVID first occurred, the way that everybody, like, you know, we had all these, you know, together we're better, all that stuff, and as soon as we got to let that go, we did, right? Maybe you remind us, right? You come back to that. You say, you know what? We do have the capacity to get it together as a board to do what's best for kids. We have an example of that. When we had to figure this out to make sure we were still educating these children when COVID first happened, we made it happen. And even our last meeting, right? The data shows that there was still learning happening despite that. We got to stay and keeping those things front of mind, that we have the capacity. The answers are in the room. The capacity is in the room. We have to always remind ourselves of that. I think that's the big piece of it. So This is a lot of text on this slide. So because we're going to start talking about like roles and responsibilities, and then we're going to move into norming because we're in our last hour. But who does what is what I want us to think about, right? It's the superintendents, while working closely with the school board, have responsibilities that mirror those of the CEO of a traditional business or corporation. In most instances, the superintendent is responsible for the effective management of a multi-million-dollar educational enterprise. She is, right?
Right.
School districts are often one of the largest employers, if not the largest in the district, the largest food provider. They manage the largest transportation operation in their communities. So that's a huge responsibility. Like, people need to always think about school systems as that, right? The entire school district operation is the superintendent's sole responsibility. And while the superintendent may ultimately delegate management responsibility to other key personnel in their cabinet, et cetera, it's still the accountability for overall operations rests on the superintendent. Now, this means if something goes wrong, who y'all coming to?
Me.
Right? Right? So accountability for the overall operation is the expectation that any superintendent willingly assumes that when they apply for this job. Right. Now, in the ideal line of authority, every school employee in the district is ultimately accountable to the superintendent, while the superintendent alone is accountable to who?
The board.
The board. So perhaps one way to describe the accountability equation is that the superintendent is accountable for a school district's operations, and the school board is accountable for how the school district operates. I'm letting that sit for a second.
Yeah, that's it.
And while the roles are complex, effective board superintendent teams can operate successfully with these understandings. This is not in your text. It comes from another good book that I will recommend that you guys invest in later after we're done with this one. Building Relationships, Yielding Results. How superintendents can work with school boards to create productive teams, right? I think this is your next level of work when we're done with the governance core. And yeah, and there's another one too, building great school board superintendent teams. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of research out there. I mean, I wanted us to focus on the governance core, but there's so much out there. You guys don't need to be reinventing the wheel. But at the core of this, we got to figure out this who does what. I think will help drive the work of this board in particular. So let's do a quick exercise. We're going to take 10 minutes on this because I really want us to get to start the norms. The norm process could be a little bit long, so I want to turn it over to Dr. Swimson for that. But what issues should the superintendent address without consulting the school board for its opinions or approval? What issues or decisions should the school board entertain without the superintendent's input? And then what issues require collaboration between the board and superintendent before any action is pursued? I want you to take a couple of sticky notes. Take 3, right? And 3 or 3-ish. And I want you to jot down, take 10 minutes, individually respond to each question, and then place each response on an individual sticky note. Okay, so just let's do 5 minutes instead of 10, because we're getting short on time. See, I told you that 6 hours thing. I could do 6 hours if I needed to. Didn't I tell you that?
And you can just bullet your responses. Mm-hmm.
We can get them started.
Mm-hmm.
2 more minutes.
I'll do a separate chart for.
We bring them up now?
Yeah, you can. Label it. That's a Jeopardy sound there.
Thanks for everybody coming.
All right,
Oh,
we're
we
gonna
did-
post
okay.
them like, Inger's kind of labeling our chart like a my job, your
Okay.
job, our job. Because we wanna put them up and just have a quick discussion.
Job.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just then.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll put these up there, right? Okay.
Inger, let it take his stickies, Inger.
All right, this is number one, the superintendent's addresses these without consulting. This is the board, and this is collaboration.
All right, I'll just put these up there.
Here that are related just to the work of the superintendent, you know, some of the day-to-day operations of the system, which is what we talked about quite a bit. The instruction and the decisions that relate to instruction, curriculum, all of those things typically fall in the realm of the superintendent. Also, staff development and motivation. How do we make sure that if we want to have this staff that is awesome, that's going to be teaching the students that are awesome, because remember, that's our moral imperative is the students, then how do we make sure that they have the professional learning that they need, and how do they stay motivated to do it? Because if you think about right now, there are a lot of school systems that are struggling with staffing. That's a huge issue right now.
No teachers and no bus
A lot of
drivers.
vacancies. So how do we create a space so that they're motivated enough so that they want to stay, but also how do we create a culture that says you're welcome here? Also, some of the other areas of job fairs and recruitment, we talked a little bit about that. School closing, curriculum alignment and standards, also transportation problems, teacher shortages. What do we do about those things? And the operational issues and safety concerns. All of those things fall over here in the superintendent's realm. This is based on what you all said. This is what you're saying that Dr. Birdsong should be doing, right?
And does not need to involve you in them. Yeah.
Without consulting the school board, okay? Without the input, all right? So here's what the school board can entertain without the superintendent's input. Community engagement. How do we involve the community in a way that's meaningful for them? Also, input. We've talked a bit about that. How are we going to hear what our constituents are saying? How are we going to hear what the stakeholders are saying? And also thinking about the issues and decisions, without superintendent. I see none here, so there shouldn't be any issues that are board only. Again, based on the brainstorming here. And then the organization of the board, that should be a board-only issue. Choosing the superintendent should be engaged with all decision-making of the board. And then also policies and goal setting. And superintendent as an employee, I think that's what it is. So thinking about that, as a board, you all have some work to do, because I see some differences in terms of what you think your role should be without input of the board. And then collaboratively looking at what are some of the goals that we have? What's our budget, okay? And again, this is long term. Also, what are some of the policies that need to be developed? How do we do that collaboratively? How do we do that in a way that is going to bring about the change that we want? And again, address the moral imperative. Strategic planning, I see, budget, goals and measures. So a lot of agreement here in terms of what you all need to be doing together. What's interesting is the sticky part right here.
Mm-hmm. The second question is
what
issues and decisions should
what you all are saying
without
to do without the superintendent's input.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely need to have some more conversation about that, right? Because that's one of the reasons why we pose these questions. Like the whole, what's my job, what's your job, what's our job, right? And we want to move into developing some of these norms for that, because we know that the norms that are going to help strengthen the relationship and unify this board, they have to help you govern individual behavior. They have to help you facilitate the work of the group. They have to enable the group to accomplish the tasks that you all set forth. You have to ensure that everybody contributes in productive ways, but within their lane, right? And we want to increase your productivity, and we want to facilitate achievement of especially the academic goals, and also have all that happen in a way that reflects your values. So we're going to move into an activity where we're going to start to look at that. So here's what you saw in the text about the guidelines for serving on the board. Mm-hmm. Reserving judgment, listening empathetically, staying focused on content, always being true to the norms which we're going to develop, and not taking differences personally, going back to your Q-tip, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want you to think about these if you want to. I don't know what page it's on, because as we develop norms, as Dr. Swimson walks you through this exercise, this next part of Act 23, thank you, that you want to be thinking, if we're saying these are the guidelines, reserving judgment, listening empathetically, staying focused on content, having norms that we're going to hold ourselves to, and not taking differences personally, we're going to want to develop norms around these areas. That last paragraph from that page says, if all else fails, after many attempts to accommodate the views and behaviors of a given trustee, it's important for the board to move forward in fulfilling its governance responsibilities. Irreconcilable differences or behaviors that repeatedly violate the agreed upon norms cannot be allowed to keep the board majority from doing its job. And what we know is with this board, I think that has been the case, right? Where we've allowed the derailing. Nor can the board allow itself to become consumed by the situation at the expense of carrying out its critical responsibilities. And I would say at the expense of students in that case, right? If the board has been fair in trying to resolve their differences over time, the difficult board member will receive little support from peers, and in most cases, issues will be resolved by following steps 1 to 5. You all need processes and norms for what 1 to 5 can look like, and so that's where we want to move you into now. Here's your current board governance norms and protocols. Adopted in 2018, revised in 2020. I will tell you, one of the things that we always tell folks is that you can't expect anybody to unilaterally, wholesale adoption of old or borrowed norms don't work. And when you have a new board member, you have to do the norming process again. You've gotten a new board member. So, that whole forming, storming, norming, performing, they always say that even if you get to high performing, you add a new person, guess what? You're back to forming. And so, early on when I mentioned norms and procedures, people were saying, we already have those. We already have those. We have them. And they might have been handed to you when you came on, right, Dr. Austin? They were like, oh, here's our norms, right?
Yes.
And I guess the question I'm going to ask you is, do you all live up to these norms?
No.
And the question I'm going to ask you is, do you know them?
Yeah.
No.
Without looking them up? Right? So, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to make, I guess, one clarification. So these these norms and protocols that you see, it may appear like they've just been kind of rolled over from one to another, but we did, as part of our organizational meeting, we did review, reaffirm some, modify others. So I just wanted to put that out there, like that we did do that.
Do you do a pulse check of them?
Well, that's the part that I think is missing. And then what happens when we're not adhering to
Right.
those norms, that's the part that's
The
missing.
accountability.
But developing and, having agreement around that, that's, did we do that every time, like this past time with a new board member? We did not. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that even in one board member, you need to,
Well, because when you come in new and you're given a list of the norms and protocol, and you're told you can read over them, and then we get into, if you say, well, I don't really disagree with this, then it turned out to be a huge discussion, and rather than just getting a clean sheet of paper. I've never been in a situation until I came to Norfolk School Board where we were just handed the norms and protocol, and, and then we could beg to get them changed or ask for a vote on it. It would have just been so much, I never felt like I owned it.
Because you were told to buy into it, right?
Right,
There's a difference
exactly.
between ownership and buy-in, absolutely.
That's why when Dr. Ralston came on, I kept saying, you're coming on at a good time because we're starting governance training, anew, and so that he could be a part of that process. And
Excellent.
although it's
sorry.
taken longer than expected.
I was going to say, so our last time together, we talked about the behaviors that you all expressed that impacted more relationships. This was that wordle that I had from what you all said, right? Power grabs, staging a coup, no desire for accountability. And I only bring it forward because I want to use the example, right? The one that's on here was that surprise tactics. And see, here's a sample norm for how you address that. The school board members and superintendent recognize the importance of proactive communication and agree there will be no surprises. If the superintendent or board members have questions or concerns, they agree to notify one another in advance. Simple, right? And it addresses a behavior that you all said was problematic for the relationship building on the board. And so we only have 35 minutes left together, and so what we want to do is we want to move you into beginning to develop the norms that are going to address some of the things we've talked about here today. One of the things I want you to think about is, remember, these norms address how you govern, how you communicate, how you improve, how you collaborate, and we want you to focus on a couple of key areas: time, listening, confidentiality, decision-making, participation, and expectations. We may not get to them all today. That's okay. We're going to get started. And if on our next time together we pick back up with the same conversation, that's fine. I've said this before, I'm less about getting through the slides and more about us having these conversations that are going to help us get to doing this work with fidelity. So some of the behaviors might be, okay, we want to reserve judgment. We want to listen empathically. We want to stay focused on content, not behavior or style. We want to always be true to the norms of the board. Don't take things personally. Move forward in fulfilling responsibilities. Those are what it could look like. So I want you to reflect on and begin to record the behaviors that you think are ideal for this group. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Swimpson, who's going to.
But let's go back to what
Go back
harms
on.
impact board relationships. So as you are thinking about these norms, think about the impact that these behaviors have had on your ability to work together. Use these as your guide for changing that narrative and changing those behaviors by creating norms that address these things that are impacting, that are harming. So as you're thinking about them, consider, how do we restore what we want? These are the behaviors that are impacting and causing us harm. So how do we change these behaviors so that we are restoring the types of behaviors, whether it be, whether those behaviors focus on the way that processes are done, whether they focus on relationship building, whether they focus on what we want as an end result. What do we need to do? How do we reshape these, reframe these, tell a counter story that will give us the types of guidance or norms that we need? Because keep in mind, norms basically are the way in which we are going to engage and interact with each other on a daily basis when you come together. It's good to go back and talk about those things. Usually what's most helpful with organizations, with groups when they are going through this process, is every time they come together, they talk about our norms.
They start with them, yeah.
We start with those, or we go back and say, let's take a minute and review our norms. Can we all agree that this is how we're going to engage today?
And I think the other caution I want to have, because these came from our one-on-ones, right? So as you're thinking about the behaviors, I don't want you thinking about the person, because you get caught up in that too. So it's not about the individual. You're not making a norm for the person who did this harm to me. You're doing a norm for how will we as a board, I know, right? How will we as a board ensure that none of us ever feels this particular thing again? Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree
And
with
so,
that.
so that's that's the other thing, because I know these came from our one-on-one conversations that were specific to, here's how I was harmed. But what we're trying to do is ensure that we create a culture on the board where no one is harming the other.
So go back to the Q-tip.
Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna go back to this slide, and you just take your sticky notes and begin to do the reflection. How much time do I have?
And let's really dig into this. So I'm gonna say at 3:40, that we come back together. So take your time and really think about, what are we trying to change in terms of specific behaviors that we feel have harmed, or you've caused harm, or are harming.
And I'm going to add one other thing too. This goes back to Ms. Bassane's point, right? You have the other document. So we don't need to rewrite those. We're not doing any wordsmithing at this point, because we can come back to that. What I want you to think about is, what are we missing? Like, because we had this on paper already, right? Yes, we may not have revisited it, but it may not have all of the norms that you need to have in place for this board, for where you all are, right? And so the examples I gave there are the how we govern, but I kept hearing a lot of process, right? So maybe you say, we need a norm around how we develop our processes, or how we communicate out, after decisions are made. All of those things. So think about those areas of focus. I just gave this to you as some guidance, but so kind of focus on those, so that it's not a redundant, it's not a rehash of the other ones, but it's maybe you need 3 new ones that we add to the other list, and then we agree to hold each other accountable to the previous ones and these 3 new ones. Does that make sense? Okay.
So you don't want us to necessarily focus on the block of behaviors that are right there.
You can. Those are for guidance, right?
Okay.
So I want you to think about, what are the ideal behaviors for this group, given the things that you're experiencing from one another now.
So all of these are ways to guide and frame the norm, but you think about what it is that you need. If you had to create the ideal way that everybody on this board would engage and interact with each other on a regular basis, what would it look like? So take the 10 minutes to really think that through. All right, it's 3:30, head till 3:40?
Mm-hmm.
about 4 minutes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mhm.
Should be all writing these in the positive rather than the do nots.
Right now, just brainstorm them, and we can go back and make adjustments. Because keep in mind, this is a draft. These aren't in final form.
Because I couldn't figure out a way to make
Yeah.
my negative thought positive.
Just get the thought out.
Okay.
Because we're going to theme them, so we're definitely not going to get it
Yeah,
all done
because I don't
today,
think
but
that they
we're
should
gonna see
be
how it
negative
goes.
up there. It's just I'm trying to have, I'm having a little problem thinking how to not
We're
put
putting
do
them on
not.
Post-its?
Yeah.
Okay. Without sentences. How did I do? I just started writing.
Me too. I just jotted down some.
Okay, so we're gonna ask for your 5.
Post-its.
Oh, it's you only 5.
3 to 5.
Did you want it on the
Maybe
Post-its?
6?
Yeah.
Please.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah.
Read it. Oh, well.
It's okay if you got more than that, that's fine. There's gonna be some redundancy, so that's probably how you do
Yeah.
individually,
Yeah,
so
okay.
that's okay. We're gonna look for themes.
That's all right. This is good.
There's 8.
If you got 3 to 5, you got 8, go for it.
But hold on to them. A second, we're not ready to post them just yet. So as you're transferring, as some of you are transferring those to Post-its, I want you to keep the first one that you jotted down. That's the one that you're going to report out. The first one that you jotted down.
Because it was probably the most important to you.
May have been, may not have been, but the first one is the one that we want to hear. And as you're sharing, we're not going to ask for agreement, we're not going to ask for clarification, we're not going to question or anything. We just want to give voice to that draft norm. And notice that I said draft because, again, as Valda said, we're going to go back and start placing these, hopefully being able to theme them. But if there's some that we can't theme, that's okay. This is the start of our norming conversation and creating norms, again, that are generated by this board, all right? Yep.
Oh, yeah, your time's up.
Okay, all right. Let's see. part of me that I did not share is that I grew up very close to this area. I'm from Elizabeth City, North Carolina. So Elizabeth City is just through the swamp, as we used to say. You go through the dismal swamp to get to Elizabeth City. So the person who lives closest to Elizabeth City, that's the person that I want to start. There we go.
Focus on the children.
Okay, thank you. Another. We can go this way. We'll go around this way.
Okay, cool. Seek out understanding before placing judgment.
Okay.
Be respectful to one another.
Okay. Ready for the next
And
one?
if yours is red, and if you want to pick another one, if like you already heard yours and you want to pick another one, you can do that too, so you can be additive.
I just said, trust.
Okay.
So I did have to be respectful, so I will pick another. My other is act ethically.
Okay.
Info shared with one, shared with all.
Say that again.
Info shared with one, shared with all.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. Get that one. Okay,
Got a lot,
yeah,
and they're long.
sorry, so I'm trying
No
not to, I'm
apologies.
trying not to repeat
No
what's already been
apologies.
stated. So, responding to communication in a timely manner.
Okay.
Everyone gets to have an opportunity to share their opinion.
All right. Okay, so we are just starting the norming work, as I shared. I wanted to just give everybody an opportunity to get a sense of some of the things that are kind of percolating with people. And especially starting with the first one, because as Valda mentioned, that's probably the one that's kind of most pressing for you, that's kind of eating at you right now, or that you just want to elevate because you think it would work best for the group at this time. We're going to take those Post-it notes back with us and begin processing them, even in the form that they're in. So don't worry about if it's, if they're not spelled right, or if you didn't do something that you wanted to do or didn't write something. Don't worry about that right now, because this is the start of the norming process for us. I'm going to ask if you would just place these up here, and to ensure that they travel safely with us, I'm going to tape them down to make sure that the Post-it notes stay there. And then we will record those so that when we come back again, we'll have an opportunity to begin thinking about and getting clarification, because I heard respect, right? Be respectful, or be respectful over
I had
here.
that, but if it was
Respect
Adele.
and respect and
To
respect.
each other.
Does that mean the same for both of you?
Yeah, it's a subjective term, right?
Yeah.
So much like I'm sorry, I was gonna say, much like, I typed up the notes from last time and sent them back to you, we're gonna type these up just as they are here, but then we're gonna continue the conversation. And when we type them up, we're gonna have them in themes. So you might see it says respect, 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 right? You're gonna see the theming. So I think because we don't wanna rush through the process, we're taking them all from you. You'll be able to see where do we still have some that are missing. Because we'll be able to say when we theme them, okay, these are all have to do with communication. These all have to do with, with expectations. These all have to do with behaviors of how we treat each other. So we'll have those themes. Then when we come back together, we'll be able to say, okay, this is what you said. What's the norm that we want to write that's going to address that? Make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So so we're giving up. So even though put on here may not be necessarily what you write, is that what we're saying?
No, it's going to
It's
be
gonna be
written
exactly?
exactly the way
Okay.
you have it here when we come
come
back,
back.
because what we need to do is clarify. Like I said, there's respect here and respect here. Does that mean the same thing? So
Okay.
let's make sure we're clear on what these draft norms mean for everyone. And when we come back, when I ask for clarification, I'm not going to throw that out for everybody to clarify, only the person who owns it. So the author of that will say, well, here's what I meant by it. Now, if we've got two that are just alike, like Noelle and Adele, if Noelle says, well, here's what I meant by respect, and Adele's like, that's exactly what I meant, then we have agreement on what respect means between the two of them, and then we can seek agreement from everyone. But if Noelle says, that's not how I see respect, then we just say, okay, there's a difference here. And we then clarify what that difference is. And we still hold on to both of them, but as you're developing the norms, you might find that, you know what, I like the way that Adele shared what respect means, so I'm gonna lean more into that, and then I may pull in some of the points that Noelle shared when she defined it.
What we
All right.
ultimately want to get to is like this, the sample here, that sample statement. We don't want to spend time drafting and wordsmithing now, but we want to be able to delineate what areas we definitely need to have norms under. And so each of your individual sticky notes will help us to do that. And we don't want to rush through that. So that'll be the early part of our next time together. Does that make sense? Okay, good.
So yeah, if everybody.
Protocols.
You
Where
post
will
there.
protocols fall?
So yeah, we're gonna talk in a little bit about next steps for all the work that we're gonna do. So I'll get to that.
Sorry.
Yep, you can go ahead and post those.
I just wrote numbers so you could tell my run-ons, where the
Okay.
difference was for my run-on.
Yeah, they're all going up.
okay.
Yeah,
I
we're
just
taking that
wanna
with
make
us.
sure.
Get a trip to haul all your 8 down there.
No, I'm just, well. Okay.
Sorry, I had a lot.
And to Ms. Bassane's point, when she said, what about the protocols, right? For each norm, we're gonna ask, what does it look like? How do we get to that? What's the protocol for that behavior, for that norm? So we'll have that conversation as well. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, yeah. Oftentimes, folks say, well, this is the norm and here's the ground rule, right? So we're gonna do that. Once we have the norm established, what's the protocol for that behavior? You got tape?
I'm gonna
No, you're
take
fine.
everything down.
You're so neat. Everyone, look at them all lined up.
We went to good schools.
Uh-huh.
Is all of this on that QR code? Do we have access to all of this?
Yeah, I'm gonna drop the slides. This
Okay.
is gonna be dropped into
That's
the,
okay,
into the toolkit. We're gonna talk about that in a moment, in our last few minutes together. It's just, look, that's what I was asking. Yeah, no, it's for next time. I'm gonna just highlight it. All right, as they're finishing up posting those, I told you what our next steps are we're gonna theme them out, we're gonna bring that back forward for our next conversation. We also want to, as part of what we had decided about what's next, was we wanted to come to consensus and revisit and revise the current mission statement. So that was one of the things that you all charged me with, and so I want to just preview for you what our next agenda will look like. So we will continue to do the norms and develop the procedures for what they will look like. We're going to, and we'll have an agenda planning meeting, so I'm putting this in the space because I want you guys to discuss it and say, well, let's get back to Val that maybe we want to prioritize this, that, whatever it is, right? We wanted to, so the one thing was the revising mission statement. The other thing was you wanted to reaffirm and communicate current priorities of the board, which right now on the website are different than what you said your current priorities are. So that's why I stamped that revise as well. And the reason why I think we have to do those two things first is because if we're saying we want to establish board level governing and strategic plan monitoring, that needs to be guided by the mission statement and part of your priorities. Right. Okay, so I feel like those are the steps in our work. So finishing the norms, then moving into the visions, the mission statement, so doing the reanalysis of that. Because what each one informs the other, frankly, right? Mm-hmm. If we're saying this is how we're gonna behave and govern ourselves, right? Does it align to our mission statement? We discussed last time that the mission statement is no longer in alignment, so we need to have some work done around that. So we will spend time on that. And we also want to say, if our priorities are mission-centered, mission-driven, we got to be clear about what our mission is, right? And so I want to be thinking about those priorities. Those priorities have to be tied to the strategic plan. And so we have to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. And from there, develop the board's theory of action. So I'm very intentional in the steps that we're taking you through. And so our next steps are to, one, complete our norming, but then move into the discussion around the mission statement, think about the board priorities. And I will say this too, there can be some work that's done between when I come back to you, right? Because we'll be into September by then. Your board priorities should be something you're having discussions about. So if in the course of our time before I'm with you again, you can send me, here's our draft priorities, here's some revisions we've made, that would be helpful to drive the conversation, because I want us to develop that theory of action statement that you can put on the website, that you can communicate out to folks. People need to know that if we, right, if the board, if we do fill in the blank, then we expect to see this result. That needs to be what's communicated out to the public. So that's the direction that I'm taking you all in. So we want to be thinking about these pieces. What I've given you, I'm going to hold on. What I've given you in the toolkit are a couple of resources that I think you should read that will help inform some of that conversation. So in the toolkit, you have I want you to read chapters 3 to 5. But most importantly, the other resources I'm not necessarily assigning, but the one that I am assigning to you is the PELP Coherence Framework. Are any of you familiar with that and read it before? Okay, it comes from Harvard. So I see some head nods, yep. So it's the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard University. It talks about how you build coherence and how you do that with systems thinking and really thinking about all those core areas. So I ask you to read this as a refresher because I think it'll help to inform our conversation. Of course, we also want you to read chapters 3 through 5 and the PELP Coherence Framework, but the other resources that are in your toolkit are just other things around roles and responsibilities and things we've talked about norms. So you've got a couple of resources to read in your free time. I'm assuming there's free time, right? So that's your homework, and that's kind of what we're tasked with. Again, we will have an agenda planning meeting, but I wanted to give you an overall frame of where we're headed. I don't want us to ever have to feel like we have to rush through these things, which is why I'm like, we're not going to cram in the last 30 minutes of doing norms. We're going to get it started, and we're going to pick back up where we left off as we think about doing that work. Questions for me before we continue? All right, we want to do a quick reflection so that you can process what we've done today. We did a lot, by the way, and I want to thank you for leaning into the conversations and really, I feel like you all are, I feel like you're taking this seriously. Like you know what I mean? Like this is not, and I know that can be, governance training can feel like training, right? I would say you don't train adults. We build capacity to do the work well, right? You train puppies, right? Mm-hmm. This is not really training. This is really about members of a community of practice really leaning in to do this work. And so I appreciate your willingness to do it in that way and to trust me to help guide this process. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a few minutes, and you don't have to write this down, but I want you to think about, and you can say them out loud, 3 concepts or ideas that are most important for you all to enact upon, 2 concepts that we have to further explore as a board, and 1 next step. So for the sake of time, I'll let you pick 1 of each. You don't have to. You can pick 1 to share out. You can say, here's my 3, here's my 2, here's my 1. But just take a second, think about it, and then let's share those out loud. I'm going to hear from every single person, and we're going to go around the room. So you pick your 3, your 2, or your 1 to share aloud.
Is this related to board governance?
Related to what we've done, all of our work that we've been talking about so far. The little one, the kindergartner. Great Auntie Belle. You can't say me easy. He calls me Great Belle. Okay, I got a new name for you. Belle. We ready to share? Okay, I got a 3 or 2 or a 1.
Or 1. I have 1.
one.
Okay. All right, let's go. Let's start with Ms. Hussein. I'll start with you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going this way this time because we started that.
All right, I'm still in the midst, but I will share at least one concept or idea, developing concrete processes for receiving information, deliberating on that information, and taking action. Two concepts, well, okay, so I was on the one, exploring how we utilize our board standing committees and whether we move to become a committee of one. And then I hadn't quite.
That's fine.
To the next
Keep
step.
thinking about it. But yeah, we wanted to hear,
Okay.
put someone in the room. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Lauren, you want to go next? You can share a 3, or 2, or a 1.
On 3, I would be interested in developing our, firming up our process for having discussions about items when we're meeting in a board meeting, so that we respect everyone's opportunity to be able to get their key points out, but we also respect the fact that we have a certain amount of time for everything. And maybe part of that process would include which ones would get the most time, like if it's something that has to do with children, that would get a different amount of time than perhaps something that has to do with the budget.
Perfect. Thank you. Dr. Birdsong?
A concept that we need to enact upon, I would say effective superintendent board communications. And something I believe we need to further explore is to continue to work to build the trust amongst governance team members while at the same time moving the work forward. We can't just pause while we're working on the trust. We need to keep moving forward.
Absolutely. That's why I mentioned that go ahead and continue to develop those priorities. Don't wait for us to have the conversation when I'm back. That's a whole month, right? So you're informing our agenda. You're bringing forward the work, even if it's in draft form. So to my point, yep. Excellent. Carlos?
Great. I'll do the 3 concepts. So striving on a common ground, and I just wanted to reserve the judgment one. The other one was do not take offense, differences personally. And then the one I really liked was, if all else fails, after many attempts to accommodate the views and behaviors of a given trustee, it's important for the board to move forward in fulfilling its governance responsibilities.
Noel?
I liked the statement that you put up about the superintendent having confidence in how the board can inform the success of the division. And then the other concept of the superintendent being in charge of the operations, but the board working on how the division operates. And then last and most importantly, are the decisions, actions, and energies that we are taking, are they resulting in student success or student harm? Always end with that, asking that question with our actions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Two concepts we should further explore as a board, and one was looking at the whole notion of mindset, and then I also added skill sets, because I think it's a combination. Those two could go together. Looking at some really tangible things that we can work on, mindset and skill set, to become a highly performing board. And then number 2 was supporting staff and help creating a positive, help the superintendent and the school system create a positive organization environment. I think that's something we can discuss also, that we are deemed supportive. I think that's very important.
Culture, creating a culture of
Culture.
support.
That's always my big cheerleader. Like, we have to have a positive culture. One of the things that I thought that we need to address is creating more professional relationship building. So we don't have to be chummy, but we can be professional, and I think that's what we're here to do. You know, this kept gnawing at me a little bit. It's the one about don't take things personally, and also don't make personal attacks publicly, right? So I was trying to think like there's a flip side to that, so that
Yeah.
came to mind too.
Yeah, which goes back to if we're professional and respectful, which came up, then there wouldn't be personal attacks.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
Yep, it is.
Because it's hard not to take things personal when.
And when it's personal.
When it's deliberate, right.
Mr. Jordan.
Hoping I understood the assignment correctly. I have one for each.
Okay.
Board role and responsibility as a whole, and superintendent role in advancing student achievement. What it means to be a public body advancing student outcomes. And for the one next step I had, this is more of a exercise, I guess, full board development of the next agenda item, advancing student outcomes.
All right. If we can
Next agenda is what I meant.
Yeah, if we can have those stickies, like just if that would be great, because that would be helpful for our notes. If you want to, if you want to clean it up a little bit, go ahead.
Less neat, but I'll give it to you.
And while you're doing that, I will again thank you so much for just the engagement. We're going to spend this time moving this work forward, and I feel like there's a big difference. I don't know if you feel it. There's a big difference from when I was here last time and this time, and I wanna commend you for that. I think last time was a little harsh. It was a little hard, right? And there's a lot of honesty, but I definitely see a different affect in the way that we showed up today. And so I think you're to be commended for that. It's a great way to start the new school year, right? If we had the Men in Black wand where we can just say, like that flash of light and say we're going to put the harms and the things that were holding us back, put them in the rear view, and move forward again for the good of the students in our public schools. I would say that I feel that today. I feel a little bit of that, and so I think we're headed in the right direction, and I'm actually really happy about that. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you all so much for your time today. It was a pleasure meeting you all and being a part of this discussion. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Can we give ourselves a hand?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to ask, right?
Sports day outside, we were in here.
Yeah, and you want to have a culture of celebration too.
That's right.
So absolutely, yeah.
We'll be back on the,
You want these?
Ingrid, they want give you the sticky notes. Let's see. We'll put them on the chart papers. Yeah, we're flying, so we want to make sure they don't get messed up. So we're going to tape them down so we can fold them and put them in our briefcase. Here, let's do it. I'll do a clean sheet for everybody, and I will take those.
Are we sticking this on a board somewhere again?
Over here.
Read the Pelt Coherence Framework. In terms of the draft.
Are we adjourned?
okay.
Yeah,
we adjourned?
I got it.
Yeah, so we'll be back on the 14th, and we stand adjourned.
Good.